Inside, I checked the doors and windows again. Nothing was broken, nothing out of place. But the feeling wouldn't go away. I decided I couldn't stay outside again without knowing more. I made a list of all possible exits from the cabin, all the places someone could hide. I stacked chairs near the doors, put heavy objects behind them. My mind raced through every worst-case scenario. The quiet seemed almost too complete now. The wind didn't sound like wind. The trees didn't sound like trees. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak, every groan of the cabin made me jump. The shadows seemed to move differently, as if something was shifting just out of sight. I stayed awake until the sky lightened slightly, clutching a baseball bat I had brought along for protection. Every small sound made me freeze. When the sun finally rose, I felt exhausted, but I knew I had to investigate the tracks. The footprints were still there, but now I could see more details. They were large, military-style boots. The prints led away from the cabin into the woods, then disappeared. I couldn't tell if the person had left in a hurry or was watching me. I checked the perimeter carefully, finding small signs that someone had been there. Broken twigs, disturbed leaves, subtle marks on the ground. Whoever it was, they had come close to the cabin repeatedly. I knew I couldn't stay another night alone. I packed essentials, left a note on the counter in case someone came looking for me, and drove as quickly as I could back to the main road. The roads were empty, the forest looming silently beside me. My hands gripped the wheel tightly. Every shadow through the windshield made my stomach turn. When I finally reached the nearest town, I stopped at a diner, shaking, needing food and normality. I called the local ranger station and reported the cabin. They said they would check it out. Later that week, the rangers returned my call. They had found signs that someone had been living near the cabin for weeks, hidden in the woods. Tents, makeshift fire pits, and supplies were scattered along the trees. The person had been watching anyone who came near, sneaking close to the cabin at night. They hadn't found the individual yet, but they warned me that it was extremely dangerous to stay there alone. I never went back to that cabin. The memory of the darkness, the silent stalking, the feeling of someone just out of sight stayed with me for months. I realized that isolation in the wrong place is not peaceful, it's dangerous. And sometimes, the scariest things aren't supernatural. They are people, patient and hidden, who wait for the right moment. The cabin remained empty, the woods silent, but I couldn't shake the image of the footprints disappearing into the trees. The thought of someone watching still lingering in my mind. Even months later, I drive past wooded areas and notice the small details. A broken branch, a shadow out of place, a rustle that seems too deliberate. The fear from that cabin trip never fully left me. I had learned that real danger doesn't announce itself. It hides, waits, and watches. And knowing that, I've become more careful, more aware, more alert than I ever was before. That cabin taught me to respect silence, to notice the unseen, and to understand that solitude can be a trap if someone is waiting. I still dream about that trip, the creaking of the cabin, the cold night air, the footsteps just outside the door. But the dreams also remind me that I survived, that I escaped, and that knowledge, that survival, became a part of me. I now take trips differently, never alone, always prepared, always alert. I never want to feel that isolation again, that sense of someone silently moving just beyond the light, waiting. The woods can be beautiful, but they can also hide the very real threat of someone who shouldn't be there. And that is a fear far more chilling than any story or fairy tale. Hours passed. The sun rose higher, and the forest gradually thinned. I finally reached a small town, where I stopped at a gas station. The people there were friendly but curious about me. I told them I had been in a remote cabin. They warned me about people wandering the woods, sometimes hunters, sometimes drifters looking for places to hide. They suggested calling the police if I felt unsafe. I thanked them, filled the tank, and kept driving. I never went back to that cabin. Later, I learned from the rental company that the cabin had been broken into a few months earlier. Nothing was stolen, but the renters had left in a hurry, claiming they felt watched. They never returned. I realized that what I had experienced was not imagination. Someone had been near the cabin the night I stayed there, moving silently in the dark, watching. Maybe they thought it was abandoned, maybe they were planning something. I would never know. Looking back, I can still feel the tension from that night, the fear that someone unseen was just beyond the walls, waiting. But I also learned to trust my instincts. I made sure to research more carefully before renting cabins, to check for road accessibility, security, and the history of the place. I learned to respect the forest, its silence, and its darkness, and I never again assumed that isolation meant safety. That weekend left a mark on me. It changed the way I traveled, the way I observed the world, and the way I listened to the small warning signs that something was wrong. I tell this story not to scare, but as a reminder. Nature can be isolating, but humans can be unpredictable and dangerous. The real fear comes not from shadows or ghosts, but from being alone, vulnerable, and uncertain of who or what might be nearby. After that experience, I became more cautious, more aware, and more prepared. I learned that fear has a purpose. It sharpens your senses, keeps you alert, and sometimes it just might save your life. Even now, years later, I remember the smell of the pine, the darkness pressing against the cabin walls, the sound of someone, or something, moving just beyond my vision. I remember the cold sweat, the pounding heart, and the way I drove until the forest ended. I survived, and I survived because I did not ignore the warning signs. The cabin is still out there, deep in the woods, silent and empty now, but I know it holds the memory of that night, the footsteps in the dark, and the reminder that being alone in a remote place can be far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. I had been driving for hours through winding forest roads, the kind that seemed to stretch forever and swallow your sense of direction. My destination was a small, isolated cabin I had rented for the weekend. I wanted to get away from everything. The city, work, people. I thought I would find peace among the trees and silence. I had packed lightly, mostly food, blankets, and a few books. My phone barely worked out here, and I liked it that way. I had never felt so disconnected, and for some reason, that feeling excited me. The forest was thick, with tall pine and fir trees crowding each other. The sun was already low when I reached the last turnoff, a narrow dirt track that disappeared into the trees. I drove slowly, my headlights cutting weakly through the dense shadows. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, crisp and slightly sweet. It was beautiful, but as I drove deeper, I started noticing things I had not seen on the map. Tire ruts that didn't look fresh, strange patches of flattened grass, and tree branches broken at unusual heights. I told myself it was probably just animals or logging work. I tried not to think too much about it. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a wave of relief. It was small, wooden, and looked old but sturdy. A thin column of smoke rose from the chimney. That was strange because I was sure I had the place to myself. I parked and stepped out. The air was colder than I expected, sharp and clean. The forest was silent in a way that felt unnatural. I shrugged it off. The cabin smelled of wood and something faintly musty. There was a fireplace, a simple bed, a small kitchen, and a table with 2 chairs. I set down my bag and walked around, touching the walls, the door handles, the windows. Everything seemed normal, nothing out of place. I decided to start a fire in the fireplace. The wood was dry and crackled pleasantly as the flames took hold. I felt a little warmer, a little safer. As the sky darkened, I went outside to gather more wood. The forest was dense, and the shadows stretched long. I collected branches and logs, stacking them neatly near the cabin. It was peaceful, almost meditative. That is, until I heard it. A snapping sound behind me. I froze. My heart jumped. My breathing quickened. I waited, straining to hear anything else. Nothing. Maybe an animal, I told myself. But it did not sound like the kind of snap a deer or a raccoon would make. This was heavier, deliberate. I went back inside and locked the doors, even though I knew there were no locks other than the old rusty latch. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was a tree branch falling. Maybe I was just imagining things because of how quiet it was out here. I made some food, a simple pasta meal, and ate slowly, listening for any other sounds. Outside, the wind picked up, making the trees groan and sway. I could hear branches tapping against the cabin. I decided to take a shower. The water came from a small tank heated by the fireplace. Steam filled the bathroom, and the room smelled of hot wood and metal. I stood under the water, trying to wash away the uneasy feeling. That's when I heard it again. A soft thump like a boot landing on the porch. I froze, letting the water run over me. My mind raced. Maybe someone had come up the track and was hiding nearby. But that was impossible. The road was hardly passable, and I had not seen a single car in hours. I wrapped a towel around myself and slowly opened the bathroom door. Nothing. The cabin was empty. I listened, my heart pounding. The thump came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound along the porch railing. I grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from the kitchen and walked to the front door. I opened it a crack. The night was black, the forest pressing in on all sides. I shined the flashlight around. Nothing. Just trees, shadows, and darkness. I locked the door again and tried to focus on something else. I spent the rest of the evening stacking wood, making sure the fire stayed strong, and double-checking the windows and doors. I didn't sleep well. Every small sound made me jump. The wind, branches, my own creaking movements. I imagined someone walking around outside, watching me. I told myself it was paranoia, but deep down, I knew it was not entirely impossible. The next morning, I woke early. The forest was quiet except for birds and distant rustling. I went outside to assess the surroundings. I noticed footprints in the soft ground near the cabin, larger than mine. They were fresh. I had no idea how they got there, and a cold dread settled in my stomach. I followed the tracks a little, but they disappeared into the thick forest. I felt foolish for being afraid, but I could not shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to leave. I packed quickly, throwing my things into the car. As I did, I noticed something strange near the side of the cabin. The wood I had stacked the night before was disturbed. Some logs had been moved, others knocked over. That was impossible. I had been inside all night, and the doors were locked. Panic rose in my chest. I jumped into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove down the dirt track, I felt like something was following me. Shadows moved between the trees, just at the edge of my headlights. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was my imagination. But every time I glanced at the side mirrors, I thought I saw a figure standing among the trees. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The road stretched endlessly, twisting and turning. I drove faster, my nerves fraying. At one point, I heard a loud thump on the roof of the car. My stomach dropped. I slammed on the brakes, swerved, and the car skidded on loose gravel. I jumped out, shining my flashlight over the roof. Nothing. No damage, no footprints nearby. I got back in, trying to breathe. I decided not to look back and just drive until I reached a main road. I had been planning this trip for months. A quiet escape into the woods to get away from everything. Away from work, away from people, away from the city noise that never seemed to stop. The cabin was small, rustic, and a few miles off the main road, surrounded by thick pine trees. I drove the last stretch of dirt road slowly, feeling the crunch of gravel under the tires, the smell of damp earth and pine hitting me as I stepped out. The air was sharp and cold, the kind of crisp that makes your lungs ache a little in the first few breaths, but it felt alive, fresh, almost clean. The cabin was exactly as advertised online. 2 rooms, a small kitchen, a wood stove, and a front porch that overlooked a shallow valley. No neighbors for miles. It felt private in a way that was both liberating and a little intimidating. I carried my bag inside and set it on the worn wooden floor. The smell of old wood mixed with faint mildew filled the room. The place had been empty for a while, but it was clean enough. Dust coated the corners of the window frames, and cobwebs hung lightly along the ceiling beams. I shook off the feeling of being watched and told myself it was just the isolation. I spent the first day settling in. I stacked firewood, checked that the water pump worked, and walked around the perimeter of the cabin. making mental notes of the layout in case I needed to move quickly. The woods were dense, dark, and full of shadows that shifted with the wind. Birds called occasionally, the sound echoing strangely, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint sound of running water from a creek. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. But as the day faded, a certain quiet settled over the area. It wasn't the comforting quiet of nature. It was heavier, the kind that presses against your ears and makes every small sound seem amplified. I decided to light the stove and make some dinner. The cabin had a small propane stove as well, but I preferred the smell and warmth of the wood fire. I chopped some wood, stacked it neatly, and watched the flames catch. Shadows danced across the walls, and I realized that the walls themselves felt thinner than I thought. Every creak of the old cabin floor or gust of wind rattling the windows seemed louder than it should be. I told myself it was just the old wood settling. After dinner, I sat on the porch for a while, wrapped in a blanket, staring out at the darkness. The woods seemed endless, black, and silent beyond the reach of the porch light. I could hear my own breathing and the occasional rustle of leaves. At first, I enjoyed the solitude, the way the air smelled of pine and wet earth, but slowly, a sense of unease crept in. Something about being completely alone in a place like this made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I went inside to lock the doors and windows. They all closed, but some of the latches felt loose. I could have fixed them, but the thought of the wind rattling them all night made me uneasy. I grabbed a flashlight and went around the cabin, checking each window and door carefully. Everything seemed fine, but as I returned to the living room, I heard it, the faintest snap of a twig outside. I froze, listening. The sound came from the edge of the clearing, a distance from the cabin, and then silence. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I was tired, my nerves already on edge from the long drive and isolation. I went to bed early, curling under a heavy blanket in the small bedroom. The wind picked up during the night, shaking the cabin slightly. At first, I found it comforting, the sound of the wind mixing with the occasional creak of the wood. But then I noticed other sounds. Soft scratches against the walls, faint thuds outside, subtle but deliberate. My stomach tightened. I kept telling myself it was just animals, branches falling, the cabin settling. But the timing, the way the sounds moved around the cabin, felt deliberate. By morning, I was exhausted but still uneasy. I made coffee and sat on the porch again, trying to shake the feeling that something was wrong. The sun was out. The woods looked peaceful in the morning light, but my gut kept twisting. I decided to explore the surrounding area, thinking movement might ease my tension. I walked along a narrow path leading into the woods, stepping over roots and fallen branches. I was careful to leave markers to find my way back. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. No birds, no rustle of small animals. The silence was unnatural. Then I saw the footprints. Not my own, not animal tracks, but large boot prints pressed into the soft earth near the edge of the trees. They led from the cabin toward the woods. My heart pounded. I counted the distance back to the cabin. Someone had been here. Someone had come close enough to leave tracks in the soft ground, close to the porch. I looked around, but I didn't see anyone. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger, heavier, like a weight on my chest. I ran back to the cabin, not daring to look behind me. The experience changed the way I approached solitude. I realized that isolation could be dangerous, even when the place seemed safe. I learned to trust my instincts and to prepare for all possibilities, not just the pleasant ones. I never returned to that cabin, and I made a rule for myself. No remote trips without someone knowing exactly where I was and when I would return. Looking back, I also realized how easily fear could exaggerate reality. The forest hadn't changed. The creek still flowed, birds still sang, and the sun still rose each day. The danger had been real, but the fear I felt in the cabin had been a mix of instinct, imagination, and genuine risk. It was a lesson in vigilance and respect for the unknown, and I carried it with me in all my later trips. Even now, I remember the way the cabin smelled, the feel of the wooden floor under my feet, the shadows that moved just beyond the windows. It stays with me not as a story of terror, but as a story of caution and survival. That trip could have ended differently, but it didn't. I escaped because I paid attention, because I acted when my instincts told me something was wrong. And in that clarity, there was a kind of relief, a clear ending that didn't need fantasy or imagination, just the hard, raw reality of the world and the lessons it teaches. The night came again. I sat near the fireplace, barely sleeping, barely moving. Then, around 2 in the morning, I heard it. Slow, deliberate knocks on the door. Not the kind of knock someone does when they are lost or friendly. These were measured, testing, probing. I gripped the knife, heart hammering, muscles tense. The knocking stopped after a few seconds. I waited, barely breathing, until it started again, this time on a window. I could see the shadow of a person, crouched low, trying to stay hidden behind the rain. I realized, with a sinking feeling, that they had been watching me all day, perhaps even before the storm. They knew the cabin, they knew my presence, and they were testing me. The wind howled, the rain fell, masking my own heavy breathing, and I stayed as still as I could. Hours passed. The knocking and tapping came sporadically, sometimes long pauses, sometimes quick bursts, always deliberate. I didn't respond, didn't move, didn't make a sound. The intruder eventually left, or at least I assumed they did, retreating into the forest. Morning came, gray and cold. I didn't sleep, didn't eat much, just stayed alert, watching the tree line. When the storm had fully passed, I ventured outside cautiously. The footprints were clear. Large, heavy boots, coming from the road to the cabin, circling it, leaving the clearing, then disappearing back into the woods. My stomach twisted. Whoever it was, they had studied me, observed me, and then left. I had survived, but I knew that if I had stayed another night, they might have come back. I packed as quickly as I could, leaving the cabin as I found it. I didn't touch anything unnecessary. The forest seemed quiet now, almost peaceful, but I didn't trust it. I drove down the mountain carefully, every turn, every shadow, every sound making me flinch. When I finally reached the main road, a paved highway, civilization, other cars, other people, I felt the first relief in almost 2 days. I called the local authorities and reported the incident. They said someone had been breaking into cabins in that area, often tracking people who came up for the stormy nights, but they had no idea who or how many. They promised extra patrols, but I knew it wasn't guaranteed. I never went back to that cabin. I haven't returned to the mountains alone. The memory stayed with me, every detail, every sound, every shadow. The way it felt to be completely alone, completely exposed, completely aware that someone else had been close enough to touch you and had chosen not to. I survived because I stayed calm, because I paid attention, because I relied on my senses. But the experience changed me. I learned how fragile safety can be, how quickly solitude can turn into danger, and how real fear is when it isn't imaginary, when it isn't a story, when it isn't a ghost or a fairy tale, but a real person watching, waiting, testing, and stalking in silence. The cabin still stands. The clearing still waits. The forest still hides its secrets. And I know that someone else might find themselves alone there one day, as I did, and hope that they survive as I did. It is a lesson in caution, in awareness, and in the stark, cold truth that isolation in the wilderness is beautiful and terrifying. The ending is simple. I survived, I returned to safety, and I learned the value of preparedness, vigilance, and respect for both nature and human unpredictability. The experience left me shaken, but it left me alive, and in the clarity of that survival, I found both relief and understanding of just how thin the line is between solitude and danger. I had been driving for hours through winding forest roads, the kind that seemed to stretch forever and swallow your sense of direction. My destination was a small, isolated cabin I had rented for the weekend. I wanted to get away from everything. The city, work, people. I thought I would find peace among the trees and silence. I had packed lightly, mostly food, blankets, and a few books. My phone barely worked out here, and I liked it that way. I had never felt so disconnected, and for some reason, that feeling excited me. The forest was thick, with tall pine and fir trees crowding each other. The sun was already low when I reached the last turnoff, a narrow dirt track that disappeared into the trees. I drove slowly, my headlights cutting weakly through the dense shadows. The air smelled of damp earth and pine, crisp and slightly sweet. It was beautiful, but as I drove deeper, I started noticing things I had not seen on the map. Tire ruts that didn't look fresh, strange patches of flattened grass, and tree branches broken at unusual heights. I told myself it was probably just animals or logging work. I tried not to think too much about it. When I finally saw the cabin, I felt a wave of relief. It was small, wooden, and looked old but sturdy. A thin column of smoke rose from the chimney. That was strange because I was sure I had the place to myself. I parked and stepped out. The air was colder than I expected, sharp and clean. The forest was silent in a way that felt unnatural. I shrugged it off. The cabin smelled of wood and something faintly musty. There was a fireplace, a simple bed, a small kitchen, and a table with 2 chairs. I set down my bag and walked around, touching the walls, the door handles, the windows. Everything seemed normal, nothing out of place. I decided to start a fire in the fireplace. The wood was dry and crackled pleasantly as the flames took hold. I felt a little warmer, a little safer. As the sky darkened, I went outside to gather more wood. The forest was dense, and the shadows stretched long. I collected branches and logs, stacking them neatly near the cabin. It was peaceful, almost meditative. That is, until I heard it. A snapping sound behind me. I froze. My heart jumped. My breathing quickened. I waited, straining to hear anything else. Nothing. Maybe an animal, I told myself. But it did not sound like the kind of snap a deer or raccoon would make. This was heavier, deliberate. I went back inside and locked the doors, even though I knew there were no locks other than the old rusty latch. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was a tree branch falling. Maybe I was just imagining things because of how quiet it was out here. I made some food, a simple pasta meal, and ate slowly, listening for any other sounds. Outside, the wind picked up, making the trees groan and sway. I could hear branches tapping against the cabin. I decided to take a shower. The water came from a small tank heated by the fireplace. Steam filled the bathroom, and the room smelled of hot wood and metal. I stood under the water, trying to wash away the uneasy feeling. That's when I heard it again. A soft thump like a boot landing on the porch. I froze, letting the water run over me. My mind raced. Maybe someone had come up the track and was hiding nearby. But that was impossible. The road was hardly passable, and I had not seen a single car in hours. I wrapped a towel around myself and slowly opened the bathroom door. Nothing. The cabin was empty. I listened, my heart pounding. The thump came again, louder this time, followed by a scraping sound along the porch railing. I grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from the kitchen and walked to the front door. I opened it a crack. The night was black, the forest pressing in on all sides. I shined the flashlight around. Nothing, just trees, shadows, and darkness. I locked the door again and tried to focus on something else. I spent the rest of the evening stacking wood, making sure the fire stayed strong, and double-checking the windows and doors. I didn't sleep well. Every small sound made me jump. The wind, branches, my own creaking movements. I imagined someone walking around outside, watching me. I told myself it was paranoia, but deep down, I knew it was not entirely impossible. The next morning, I woke early. The forest was quiet except for birds and distant rustling. I went outside to assess the surroundings. I noticed footprints in the soft ground near the cabin, larger than mine. They were fresh. I had no idea how they got there, and a cold dread settled in my stomach. I followed the tracks a little, but they disappeared into the thick forest. I felt foolish for being afraid, but I could not shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to leave. I packed quickly, throwing my things into the car. As I did, I noticed something strange near the side of the cabin. The wood I had stacked the night before was disturbed. Some logs had been moved, others knocked over. That was impossible. I had been inside all night, and the doors were locked. Panic rose in my chest. I jumped into the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I drove down the dirt track, I felt like something was following me. Shadows moved between the trees, just at the edge of my headlights. I tried to calm myself, telling myself it was my imagination. But every time I glanced at the side mirrors, I thought I saw a figure standing among the trees. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The road stretched endlessly, twisting and turning. I drove faster, my nerves fraying. At one point, I heard a loud thump on the roof of the car. My stomach dropped. I slammed on the brakes, swerved, and the car skidded on loose gravel. I jumped out, shining my flashlight over the roof. Nothing. No damage, no footprints nearby. I got back in, trying to breathe. I decided not to look back and just drive until I reached a main road. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple. Get away from the city, escape the constant noise and pressure of work, and spend a few days alone in the wilderness. I wanted nothing more than silence, clean air, and the solitude of the forest. I found a small cabin listed online, tucked deep in the mountains, far from any roads or towns. The photos showed a rustic wooden cabin with a stone fireplace, a porch overlooking a small clearing, and a creek running nearby. It seemed perfect. I arrived late afternoon, carrying my backpack, a small cooler, and firewood. The dirt road leading to the cabin had grown rougher the further I drove, and by the time I parked, my car was coated in dust and mud. I unlocked the cabin door, pushed it open, and felt a strange satisfaction as I stepped inside. The air smelled of old wood and damp pine. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean, and I liked that it felt untouched, private. I set my things down and went straight to the kitchen. I had brought some frozen food and a few cans of beans, along with bottled water. The stove worked, and the small fridge hummed quietly. After unpacking, I checked the rest of the cabin. There was one bedroom with a narrow bed and a thin blanket, a bathroom with a shower and a sink, and a living area with a few chairs and a small table. Windows lined the front wall, giving a view of the clearing and the forest beyond. It was peaceful. I felt a little thrill at being alone in such a remote place. As evening approached, I started a fire in the fireplace. The sound of wood crackling and the faint smell of smoke made the cabin feel even more like a refuge. I cooked my dinner and sat in one of the chairs, looking out the window at the fading light. Birds flew low among the trees, and I could hear the creek gurgling nearby. I tried to plan my next day, hiking, maybe following the creek to a small waterfall I had seen on the map, but mostly I just enjoyed the quiet. Night came quickly. The forest grew dark, and shadows moved among the trees. I went to bed earlier than usual, lying under the thin blanket, listening to the night sounds outside. I could hear something scratching or scuffing in the distance, maybe a deer or some other animal. It didn't worry me. I drifted off to sleep. I woke several times during the night. Each time, I thought I heard more than the normal forest noises. Branches snapping, leaves rustling closer than they should, a soft thud against the cabin wall. At first, I told myself it was animals. There were bears and coyotes in the area. I had seen signs along the road warning about them. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or a small creature outside, but something didn't feel right. By morning, the unease hadn't gone away. The sun was rising, casting long shadows through the trees. I went outside to stretch and check the surroundings. Everything seemed normal. The clearing was quiet, no signs of other people. I walked to the edge of the creek, splashed water on my face, and tried to calm myself. I thought maybe I was letting my imagination run wild. I spent the day exploring a trail that ran parallel to the creek. The air was fresh, the forest dense and green. I noticed footprints along the muddy banks, animal prints mostly, but I thought I saw something odd at first, a larger shape that didn't match deer or bear. I shook it off. Maybe I was imagining things. I returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, feeling tired but satisfied. That night, the feeling of being watched returned. I couldn't place it, but every sound seemed amplified. The creak louder than before, twigs snapping in the distance, a faint crunch underfoot as if someone was walking slowly around the cabin. I tried to ignore it and built a fire, hoping the warmth and light would help. I checked the locks on the doors and windows. Everything seemed secure. I kept thinking I was being paranoid, that I had let my mind get carried away by isolation. Around midnight, the sounds grew closer. There was a series of deliberate knocks against the cabin wall. Not like an animal, too measured. I froze, listening. It happened again, 3 slow knocks. My heart started racing. I stayed perfectly still, trying to hear if there were any other noises. After a while, it stopped. I considered calling the local ranger station, but my phone had no signal. Panic started to creep in. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, sitting close to the fireplace, clutching a heavy stick I had used to move firewood. Every shadow made me flinch. Couldn't sleep. Hours passed like this. Eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the trees, and I felt a small relief just from seeing the sun. Morning came, and I decided I couldn't stay. I packed quickly, grabbed my backpack and cooler, and headed for my car. I checked the perimeter of the clearing. No footprints besides my own, no signs of anyone lingering overnight. It made me question what I had heard, but the pounding in my chest told me it had been real. I got in my car, locked the doors, and drove down the dirt road as fast as I dared. I didn't stop for gas or food. I drove straight to the nearest town, trying to shake the tension that had settled into my body. At a small diner, I sat with coffee in hand, feeling the adrenaline slowly fade. I called the ranger station and explained the situation. They promised to send someone to check the area, especially since there had been recent reports of trespassers and theft in cabins nearby. They advised never to return alone to remote cabins without checking with authorities first. Weeks later, I learned the truth. The ranger confirmed that there had been a couple living in the woods illegally. They had broken into several cabins, scavenging supplies and sometimes threatening hikers or campers. They had been living in makeshift shelters not far from the area where I had stayed. My phantom knocks had likely been one of them checking the cabin while I slept. Knowing this, I finally understood why I had felt so watched, so exposed. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The city felt suffocating. A constant hum of cars, sirens, and people who didn't notice you unless you got in their way. I wanted silence, isolation, something real. A friend of mine had recommended a small cabin tucked deep in the mountains. It was far off the grid, with no cell service, no internet, nothing but trees, air, and quiet. I didn't even think twice about renting it. I wanted to disappear for a few days. The drive itself was exhausting. I had to navigate narrow, winding roads with steep drop-offs on one side and thick forests on the other. My little car groaned with the effort, tires crunching gravel as I climbed higher into the mountains. The sun was falling behind the peaks by the time I reached the small dirt road that led to the cabin. The forest grew denser here, dark pine and oak stretching toward the sky. A layer of mist clung to the ground, curling around the trunks like a living thing. I parked in front of the cabin, which looked smaller than the pictures, almost hidden behind a group of tall trees. It had a simple wooden porch, a chimney that puffed faint smoke, and windows dark and reflective like black mirrors. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood and damp air. Dust covered the corners, and the floorboards creaked under every step. The furniture was sparse. A small table with 2 chairs, a cot tucked against the wall, a wood-burning stove, and a shelf with a few old books. I unpacked my bag slowly, taking in the quiet. The silence was heavy, almost tangible. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, and every so often, I heard the snap of a branch. I told myself it was nothing, just the forest settling, but my stomach tightened anyway. I started a fire in the stove and hung my coat on a peg by the door. The warmth spread slowly, but it was comforting. I had food, water, a flashlight, and a first aid kit. I told myself I was prepared. I sat at the table, looking out the window at the darkening forest, the mist weaving through the trees. Shadows grew longer, and the world outside seemed to shrink into a narrow tunnel of black and gray. I felt a shiver, not from the cold, but from being completely alone. Night came faster than I expected. The cabin felt smaller, more confining. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the windows, made my heart jump. I tried to read a book to distract myself, but I kept hearing things. Soft taps, whispers of movement outside, branches brushing against the cabin. My mind raced. There's a difference between being alone in a cabin and being alone in the wilderness. In the city, even at night, you know someone is nearby. Here, there was no one, and that was terrifying. Around midnight, I decided to lock the doors. I checked the windows, made sure everything was secure. Then I heard it. A faint scraping sound outside, like something dragging across the porch. My heart stopped. I froze, listening. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the scraping continued in my mind. I could feel my chest tighten with every tiny sound. The wind rustled the trees, and sometimes it sounded almost like whispering, like voices carried on the gusts. I could barely breathe, couldn't sleep. I sat in the darkness, flashlight on, listening. Hours passed. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement through the window. Shadows shifted, and I would convince myself it was just the trees, the mist, my imagination running wild. But the feeling of being watched didn't leave. I tried to rationalize it. There's no one around for miles. It's just the forest. Yet, the sensation gnawed at me, a cold pressure at the back of my neck. Around 3 a.m., it became worse. I heard a low thump against the cabin wall. Then another. My blood ran cold. Thump, thump. Irregular, slow, deliberate. Someone or something was outside. My mind screamed at me to stay calm. Maybe it was a branch, falling from one of the tall trees. But the thumps weren't random. They were almost measured, intentional. My stomach churned. I grabbed a knife from the drawer, held it tightly, and crept toward the window. I dared not look directly outside. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, listening. Then I realized something worse. The thumping had stopped. Dead silence fell. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that makes your ears ring, where even your own breathing seems loud and alien. I waited, straining to hear anything, but the forest seemed to be holding its breath. Then I heard it, footsteps on the porch. Slow, careful, deliberate. Not the scurry of an animal. Human. Panic surged through me. I ran to the back of the cabin, thinking maybe I could climb out a window, get to the car, escape. But the back window was stuck, and the small door at the side led to a steep embankment. I was trapped. The footsteps stopped just outside the front door. I pressed myself against the far wall, trying to control my shaking. My mind raced through every possible scenario. I had no phone service. Nobody could hear me. I was completely alone except for whoever or whatever was outside. Minutes passed. Then a new sound. Scratching at the door, faint but persistent. Something was trying to get in. My body froze. I held the knife as close as I could, knuckles white, listening to the scratches that slowly became louder, more urgent. My mind screamed at me to do something, but my body refused to move. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, sweat soaking my shirt, my throat dry. Then I heard a voice, not speaking words, just a murmur, a low hum. I couldn't understand it, and I didn't want to. My instinct was to stay hidden, invisible, as if my fear alone could make me disappear. But then, something in me snapped. I realized waiting passively would get me killed. I had to act. I ran to the stove, grabbed the iron poker, and flung the cabin door open. The porch was empty. The night was still, the mist curling around the trees. My stomach dropped. I spun around, looking, listening, heart racing. Nothing. No footprints. No one in sight. I thought maybe it had been an animal after all. But the steps, the scratches, too deliberate. Someone had been there and they had left. But how? And why? Fear and relief collided in my chest. I sat on the floor, shaking, trying to calm myself. I spent the rest of the night huddled near the stove, listening to the forest, ready to react at the slightest sound. I had been driving for hours before I finally saw the small dirt road that led to the cabin. The sun was low in the sky, sending long, slanted rays through the thick trees, and the forest around me looked dense and almost suffocating. I had rented the cabin for a weekend, thinking a quiet place alone in the woods would be good for rest and reflection. I had no idea how quickly a place meant for peace could turn into a trap. The road was narrow, uneven, and scattered with fallen branches, which made the car slow to a crawl. The farther I went, the darker the forest became. The shadows of the trees stretched across the road like fingers, and the wind whispered through the leaves, carrying an almost constant rustling. I passed no houses, no other cars, not even a sign of life. It felt like the forest had swallowed the world outside. When I finally saw the cabin, I was relieved. It was a modest structure, wooden with a sloped roof, partially hidden behind thick pine trees. Smoke rose from the chimney, and I guessed the previous tenants had just left. The porch was covered in leaves, and a few broken boards creaked under my feet as I stepped inside. The smell of old wood mixed with faint dampness. I set my bag down and took a moment to look around. The cabin was small but functional. A fireplace, a worn-out couch, a small kitchen area, and a loft bedroom. Everything had a rustic feel, the kind that made you feel like you were stepping back in time. I unpacked slowly, trying to convince myself that the isolation was a good thing. I had wanted a break from city life, the noise, the traffic, the constant pressure. But as soon as I shut the door and the lock clicked behind me, a quiet settled that was so heavy it made me tense. Even though I knew there were no ghosts, no one else in the area, the silence was almost too complete. I could hear my own heartbeat, the creaks of the wooden floor, and the wind brushing the cabin walls. I decided to light a fire. The logs were dry, and the smell of burning pine quickly filled the cabin. I sat near the fireplace, feeling the warmth, and tried to relax. I told myself stories in my head about the peaceful weekend ahead. Reading books, drinking tea, watching the forest outside change with the sunlight. I didn't notice that the sun was dipping lower, that the shadows were getting longer, until it was too late. The first sound I heard was subtle, almost indistinct. A scraping, faint, like a branch being dragged over gravel. I froze. I had left the windows open slightly, and the wind could have caused it. But then it came again, slower this time, deliberate, close to the edge of the porch. My stomach tightened. I went to the window and looked outside, but all I saw was darkness and the dense trees, the way the wind made the leaves tremble. There was nothing there. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was a deer, maybe a raccoon. I kept the fire going, stacked more logs, and finally convinced myself I was overthinking. But then I heard another noise, the unmistakable sound of something scraping against the wood of the cabin itself. Not outside, but somewhere near the back. I froze again. My eyes darted to the back window. Nothing. I told myself I must be imagining it. I tried to sleep that night, but it was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard footsteps, soft and slow, moving around the cabin. I would sit up, heart pounding, listening, straining to catch any sound. Sometimes I thought I heard a whisper of breathing, a shuffle of boots against the porch. I told myself it was just the wind, or the old cabin settling, but my body refused to calm down. By morning, I was exhausted. I made coffee in the small kitchen, the smell of it strong in the small space, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. The forest looked normal outside, calm in the daylight, but I couldn't shake the unease. I decided to explore the area around the cabin, hoping movement and sunlight would clear my mind. As I walked the perimeter, I noticed something odd. Footprints in the soft dirt leading from the edge of the trees to the cabin. They were large, deep, and definitely human. My stomach turned. Whoever had been here last must have left recently. I followed the tracks, and they led to a small shed a few yards away, overgrown with weeds. The door was slightly open, and inside, I could see signs of recent use. A worn blanket, some old canned food, and a small knife lying on the dirt floor. My mind raced. Someone had been here, hiding, watching. Panic set in. I went back into the cabin and locked all doors and windows. I looked around the kitchen for anything that could be used as protection. A heavy cast iron pan seemed like the best option. I paced, every creak of the cabin making me jump. Couldn't leave, not safely. The dirt road was too long, too secluded. Whoever had been here might still be around. The hours passed slowly. I tried to keep the fire going, though the smoke stung my eyes and made it hard to breathe. Every sound outside made me flinch. By evening, I realized that whoever had been here could return at any moment. The forest seemed alive, waiting. I tried to make myself small, less noticeable, crouching low near the fireplace with the pan in hand. I thought about the stories I had read about people being attacked in cabins, about how isolated places could hide the worst. I had been planning this trip for months. The cabin was somewhere deep in the mountains, far from any town, with a narrow dirt road leading to it that most people didn't even know existed. I wanted complete solitude, a place where I could escape everything and everyone. Just me, the woods, and a few days to myself. The cabin looked small on the map, almost insignificant, but the pictures online promised a rustic charm. Log walls, a stone fireplace, and a deck overlooking the dense forest. It had electricity, barely, and running water from a nearby stream. It seemed perfect. The drive up was long and winding, a narrow mountain road that twisted through the forest. I passed no other cars, no other houses, nothing but trees that seemed to lean over the road like guardians, or maybe watchers. By the time I reached the final turn to the cabin, the sun was just starting to sink behind the peaks. Shadows stretched long across the forest floor, and the air smelled sharp and clean, tinged with the scent of pine and wet soil. My car's headlights illuminated the driveway just enough to see the cabin, tucked in a clearing surrounded by towering trees. The place looked exactly like the pictures, but in reality, it felt smaller, closer, more enclosed, and somehow heavier. It wasn't empty. It felt alive in a way I couldn't describe. I unloaded my things, carrying my backpack, a small cooler, and a box of supplies I had carefully packed. Food, firewood, a first aid kit, extra blankets, a few cans of water, and a fully stocked flashlight. I had checked the weather report before leaving. It promised a storm would move in that night. Heavy rain, strong winds, maybe even lightning. That didn't worry me. I liked storms, and I had grown up in rural areas. I liked being alone when it rained. There was a quiet thrill in it, a way the world seemed to shrink down to just what you could see and touch. I unpacked inside the cabin, lighting the fireplace and setting up a few candles for backup light. The interior smelled faintly of damp wood and old pine, with a hint of mothballs or cleaning chemicals. I walked through the small rooms, inspecting everything, making mental notes. The bedroom had a simple bed, a thin mattress, and a small nightstand. The bathroom was tiny but functional. The kitchen had a small stove, a sink, and cupboards with mostly empty shelves. The main room had a single couch, a small wooden table, and a few chairs. Everything was old, worn, but solid. No signs of recent visitors, nothing broken. Felt safe for now. I ate a small dinner, just some bread, cheese, and apples, and sat near the fireplace, watching the flames. Outside, the sky darkened quickly. Clouds rolled in like a black river, and soon I could hear the wind picking up, brushing the trees, shaking the windows. The first drops of rain tapped on the roof, soft at first, then louder, then a steady drumbeat that seemed to shake the cabin itself. I went around, closing windows and doors, checking that the locks worked. Everything was secure. The storm wasn't dangerous. It was just weather. I told myself that over and over, though a small part of me couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As the night fell fully, the wind grew stronger. It rattled the windows, pushed against the walls, made the trees groan and sway. The rain was now a full downpour, hitting the roof and deck with a steady roar. The forest seemed darker than usual, the shadows deep, almost black, like something could hide there. I tried to read, tried to distract myself with a book, but every few minutes I caught myself staring out the windows, into the storm, into the blackness beyond the clearing. Sometimes I thought I saw movement, shapes among the trees, but I couldn't tell if it was just the wind or my mind playing tricks. Still, I felt that old instinctive prickling at the back of my neck, the one that tells you to pay attention, to notice every sound, every change. Around midnight, the storm reached its peak. The wind howled, the rain lashed, and the cabin creaked under the force of it. That's when I heard it. A low, deliberate scraping sound outside, against the cabin. My heart jumped. The first thought was the wind moving something, maybe a branch. But then it came again. Slower, heavier, like someone dragging something across the ground. I froze, listening, straining to hear over the storm. The scraping stopped. Then, a sharp tap, like someone tapping on the window near the kitchen. My pulse raced. I had been alone all day, and now the forest seemed to press in closer, suffocating, hiding something. I went to the window slowly, careful not to make sudden movements. Rain streaked the glass, dripping down in small streams. Outside, the trees swayed violently, and the ground was slick with mud and leaves. I saw nothing at first, just the dark, the rain, the shaking branches. Then, a shape moved quickly across the clearing, almost too fast to see. My stomach tightened. Someone was out there. Someone had come up the mountain, up the driveway in this storm. I checked the door locks again, testing them, making sure everything was secure. But even as I did, I knew the locks were only a thin barrier against a real intruder. My instincts screamed at me to hide, to barricade, to do anything to survive. I grabbed my flashlight and a kitchen knife, not because I expected it to stop someone, but because it was some small measure of control. I moved through the cabin quietly, checking the windows one by one, listening. The sound had stopped for now, but I could feel it, the weight of eyes on me, from somewhere in the dark outside. My mind raced, trying to figure out how anyone could have found this place. There was no road sign, no address anyone could see from the main highway. Whoever it was, they knew exactly where to come. Hours passed. I stayed near the fireplace, keeping the light and heat on, but not daring to leave the main room. Every time the wind gusted, I thought I heard footsteps on the deck. Every time lightning flashed, I imagined someone standing outside, watching. The storm began to fade slightly in the early morning, rain softening to a drizzle, wind easing to gusts. I thought maybe the intruder had left. Maybe it was just my imagination. But when I looked outside, the deck was wet, muddy footprints leading to the edge of the clearing, then disappearing into the forest. Someone had been there. Someone had come close enough to touch the cabin. I felt the blood drain from my face. I couldn't call anyone. The phone had no signal. The nearest neighbors were miles away. I was completely alone with someone who knew I was there. The rest of the day passed slowly. I didn't leave the cabin. I moved quietly, did small chores, stacked firewood, cleaned, tried to keep my mind occupied, but I could hear every branch snapping, every bird calling, every animal moving in the distance, and I knew someone else was out there. I thought about leaving, about hiking back down the mountain, but the road was slick, muddy, narrow, and I wasn't sure if the person was still around. I had to wait, had to survive until help could reach me or the intruder left. I made a plan. If someone tried to enter again, I would lock myself in the bedroom and wait for them to leave. I had my knife and I had my senses. I had to rely on myself completely. Morning came slowly. Sunlight filtered through the trees, softening the shadows. I stepped outside, checking the perimeter of the cabin. Nothing unusual, no footprints, no signs of struggle, nothing. It was as if the night had been a hallucination. But I knew it wasn't. Something had been out there. I could feel it in the deep ache in my chest, the adrenaline still running through my veins, the way my hands trembled. I decided to leave immediately. I packed my bag with trembling hands, not daring to look around too much. I locked the cabin, even though I knew no one could break in without me seeing them. I ran to the car, sliding into the driver's seat, heart still pounding. The forest behind me seemed calm, indifferent, as if nothing had happened. But I knew it had. The drive down the mountain felt longer than the climb. Every shadow, every bend in the road made me flinch. I kept imagining footsteps behind me, in the mist, following me. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station near the highway, surrounded by lights, people, and noise. The city felt unbearably loud and bright, but safe. I could breathe again. I never returned to that cabin. I looked it up months later online, hoping to find some logical explanation, a news story about break-ins or missing people. Nothing. No one else seemed to have had trouble there. It was just a cabin, quiet, empty, waiting. But I knew the truth. Isolation can be dangerous. Silence can hide someone or something that watches and waits. Even now, years later, I can't drive past a forest without my stomach tightening. Shadows move differently there. The wind sounds different. And sometimes, at night, I hear scratches on my own window in my dreams, deliberate, persistent, and I wake up gasping for air, remembering the terror of that cabin. It taught me one thing: no amount of preparation, no amount of planning can make you immune to fear when you're truly alone. And no matter how remote or safe a place seems, you can never fully know what's out there. Then I heard it, the slow, deliberate scratching at the back door. My heart stopped. I stayed still, trying to make myself invisible, hoping they would leave. The scratching stopped, but I could hear breathing, faint, outside. I backed away slowly, trying to think. I could call for help, but there was no signal. The cabin was too deep in the woods. Whoever was outside could hear me moving. I remembered the shed. The door had been open. I had to check it. Maybe there was something useful inside, something to defend myself or signal for help. I waited until the sound of breathing faded, then crept to the door. I peered inside, empty except for the items I had seen earlier. But something else caught my eye: a flashlight, batteries, and a small first aid kit. I grabbed them, my hands shaking. Night fell again, and the forest outside became a dark wall. I stayed close to the fireplace, listening. I had food, water, and the small knife from the shed. I realized that panic would get me nowhere. I had to stay alert, calm, and ready. I checked all the windows and doors, placing chairs behind them as extra barricades. I imagined scenarios: someone trying to break in, someone waiting outside. But I refused to give in to fear entirely. I had to be smart. Hours passed like this. The night stretched endlessly. I stayed awake, dozing only briefly, fire dwindling, and the wind carrying the occasional sound of branches cracking. Every time I heard something, I froze, waited, and then realized it might have been nothing. My mind was playing tricks, but I could not afford to mistake anything. By the third morning, I knew I had to leave. Staying in the cabin was no longer safe. I packed essentials: water, food, the knife, the flashlight, and left the rest. The dirt road seemed longer than before, the trees closing in around me, but I forced myself to move quickly and carefully. Every step I took, I scanned the woods. I heard the occasional rustle, but nothing followed me. I kept to the main dirt road, making as much noise as I could to signal that someone was approaching. After what felt like hours, I saw a distant clearing and the faint outline of a paved road. Relief flooded me. I had survived the nights in the cabin, and now I was close to safety. I emerged onto the main road, where a few cars passed by. I flagged one down, a man in a truck who looked startled but stopped immediately. I explained quickly that I had been at a cabin in the woods and felt unsafe. He nodded, understanding, and offered to drive me to the nearest town. When I finally reached town, I went straight to the local police station. They listened to my story, took my statement, and told me that people had reported a series of break-ins and suspicious activity in the woods near that area. Some had been caught squatting in cabins like mine, watching, waiting. The officers assured me that patrols would increase and that I had done the right thing by leaving immediately. In the following weeks, I learned more. The cabin had been targeted before, and someone had been using the forest to hide from authorities. My presence, my choice to stay alone, had made me vulnerable, but I had survived because I stayed alert, planned, and didn't panic. The experience changed me. I no longer romanticized isolation or the idea of escaping to a quiet cabin. The forest was beautiful, yes, but it was also dangerous in ways I had never considered. People could be patient, methodical, and hidden. I learned to respect that, to prepare, and never underestimate the quiet. I returned home, shaken but alive. I never went back to that cabin, and I never took isolation lightly again. Every now and then, I think of the wind rustling the leaves, the long nights, and the unknown presence outside my door. But I also remember the choices I made. Staying calm, observing carefully, and acting decisively, which kept me safe. The cabin taught me that survival often depends not on luck, but on awareness, preparation, and the courage to move forward even when fear is all around you. And in that lesson, I found a kind of peace. The journey down was exhausting. My legs ached, my arms scraped against branches, and the weight of my bag slowed me, but I kept going. I heard movement behind me sometimes, rustling leaves, faint steps, but I did not look back. I focused on the path ahead. Hours later, I emerged onto a small logging road, the first sign of civilization in days. I could see smoke rising in the distance, probably from a distant cabin or small settlement. Relief washed over me, but I remained alert, keeping an eye on the woods. I walked quickly, hoping to reach a place with phone service or someone who could help. By late afternoon, I reached a small town. My hands were scratched and dirty, my clothes torn and stained, but I was alive. I went directly to the local sheriff's office and reported what had happened, giving them every detail I could remember about the cabin, the footprints, and the movements in the woods. They took it seriously, promising to investigate and warning me not to return alone. The next weeks were filled with restless nights and constant replaying of the events in my mind. I realized how lucky I had been, how quickly fear could turn into real danger when you are isolated. I avoided the mountains for months afterward, only returning with friends or in areas with clear paths and other hikers. The cabin itself remained in my memory, a dark silhouette among the trees, a reminder that sometimes isolation can hide dangers we cannot fully predict. I learned to respect it, to prepare carefully, and to never underestimate the unknowns of wilderness solitude. But I also learned that survival is possible with calm, careful thinking, observation, and determination. That experience changed me permanently, sharpening my senses, teaching me to trust my instincts, and reminding me that reality can be far scarier than any story. I never felt truly safe again in that forest, but I was alive, and that was the only ending that truly mattered. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. The cabin was deep in the mountains, far from any town or other people. I wanted the silence, the isolation, and the chance to finally escape the constant noise of my city life. I had packed carefully food, water, firewood, a first aid kit, and a flashlight with extra batteries. The roads to the cabin were narrow and winding, covered in fallen leaves, and by the time I reached the small dirt driveway, the sun was dipping low behind the trees, casting long, dark shadows across the forest. The cabin itself was older, built from rough-hewn logs, with a steep roof and a small porch. It looked abandoned, almost swallowed by the surrounding trees, but the lock on the door turned smoothly, and inside it smelled faintly of dust and wood smoke. I liked it. It felt real, solid, and quiet in a way that was rare these days. I spent the first evening unpacking and setting up the fire. The wood snapped and hissed as the flames climbed, filling the room with warmth. I made a small dinner from canned beans heated over the fire and sat on the floor near the hearth, watching the firelight play over the rough walls. Outside, the wind rustled the trees, and sometimes a bird called far off in the distance. It was perfect, or at least it seemed that way at first. I went to bed early, letting the silence lull me into a light, uneasy sleep. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound I could not immediately identify. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again, slow, deliberate footsteps outside the cabin. My heart raced. I told myself it must be an animal, a deer, maybe, or a raccoon, but the steps had a rhythm that didn't feel like any animal I had ever known. I stayed very still, listening, holding my breath. The sound stopped. I waited, straining my ears, but nothing else happened. I told myself I was imagining it, that the forest was playing tricks on me. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I fell back into a light sleep, though I woke repeatedly, each time hearing the same faint, uncertain noises. The next day, I tried to shake off the anxiety. I hiked down the narrow trail that led to a small stream, telling myself that daylight made everything safer. The sun glinted off the water, birds flitted from branch to branch, and the air smelled clean and sharp. I collected some more firewood near the cabin on my return, but as I approached, I noticed something odd. The path to the cabin, which had been undisturbed when I arrived, now had footprints, single, wide prints leading toward the cabin and stopping just at the porch. I froze, staring at them. The prints were fresh, and they didn't look like any animal tracks I knew. I couldn't see who had left them. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe someone else was staying nearby, maybe it was a hunter, or maybe, though I hated to think it, someone had followed me here. I checked the cabin carefully. The door was still locked. Nothing had been moved inside, and there was no other sign that anyone had entered. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I had left something outside that someone had come to look at, or that maybe it was just a hiker passing by. I didn't like it, but I couldn't see a way around the fear. I stayed alert the rest of the day, double-checking locks and keeping my knife nearby, but nothing else happened. The second night was worse. I had been trying to sleep, but every sound outside made me flinch. The wind, the trees, the occasional crack of a branch. It all seemed louder and closer. Around midnight, I heard it again, footsteps pacing slowly across the ground outside, circling the cabin. I could almost hear the crunch of leaves under someone's shoes. My stomach dropped. I stayed as quiet as possible, trying to make no noise, listening to the rhythm of the steps. They moved back and forth, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, but always there. I felt trapped, like the cabin had become a cage. My imagination filled in the gaps. Was someone hiding behind a tree, watching me? I didn't want to leave, didn't want to step outside, but the fear of being watched, of being trapped, was overwhelming. In the morning, I checked everything again. Nothing was broken, no doors had been forced open, but I noticed something new. Small items I had left on the porch had been moved slightly, shifted from where I had placed them. I had to admit to myself that someone had been here, someone who had been inside the perimeter of the cabin while I slept. Panic began to mix with calculation. I knew I had to do something, but I didn't want to draw attention by leaving, and I didn't know how far away help might be. My phone had no signal, and the nearest town was at least 30 miles down a winding mountain road. I felt the first real sense of dread I had ever experienced alone. My mind raced for a plan. I could stay inside and hope, or try to hike out and risk encountering whoever had been following me. Both options were dangerous. I decided to stay at least until daylight, when I could better see my surroundings. The daylight revealed more signs of someone being around. Broken twigs in the woods, trampled underbrush, and an occasional glint of something metallic caught on a branch made it clear that I was not alone. I began to prepare more actively. I gathered heavy sticks and rocks to use as weapons, cleared the area near the cabin of branches and debris so I could see anyone approaching, and reinforced the doors as best I could. I stayed near the windows, peeking through small cracks, scanning the trees. Each sound made me jump. I realized how vulnerable a cabin, isolated as it was, really could be. I had read about people breaking into remote cabins, about hikers going missing in similar areas, and the stories suddenly felt very real. I was living one of those stories now. The third night was the worst. The footsteps returned almost immediately after sunset, and this time they were accompanied by low, almost inaudible noises, soft thuds against the cabin walls, things brushing against the wood. I stayed in the corner farthest from the windows, clutching the knife, my mind racing with every possible scenario. Sleep was impossible. I imagined someone waiting just outside, ready to strike if I ventured too close to the door. I spent hours pacing inside, checking locks, reinforcing weak points, and listening to the night. At one point, I thought I heard a door creak. I froze, but it was probably just the wind, or maybe it wasn't. My nerves were frayed, my heart hammering in my chest. By the fourth day, I realized I had to make a decision. Staying inside was no longer safe. The person or people outside were testing me, seeing how I would react. I packed my bag carefully, making sure to include enough food, water, and supplies to last the hike down the mountain. I planned my route carefully, choosing the most direct trail that would lead to a main road. I waited until dawn when I could see clearly, and then I slipped out the back, moving silently through the trees, keeping to the shadows, and avoiding open areas as much as possible. Every sound made me freeze. Every branch snap set my pulse racing, but I kept moving, forcing myself not to panic. I knew that if I ran blindly, I could easily fall or attract attention. Step by step, I descended, the sun rising behind the mountains and bathing the forest in pale light. Time stretched endlessly. I couldn't go outside, I couldn't run, and I couldn't call for help. I kept the knife in front of me, listening to every sound. The intruder never tried the door again, but I could hear them walking slowly around the cabin. I stayed like that until sunrise, and then I saw something that made my stomach drop. Footprints in the dirt around the cabin, clear as day. They weren't deep, so maybe it was someone light-footed, but there was no mistake. They had been circling the cabin all night. I realized I had two choices: leave immediately or wait and hope they would go away. I decided to leave. I packed my things quickly, trying not to make a sound. I moved quietly to my car and started it, peering through the windshield. Nothing. The forest looked normal in the daylight, but I knew the tracks were still there. I drove off slowly, constantly scanning the trees. Every shadow made me jump. As I drove down the mountain road, I kept thinking about what could have happened if I had stayed. Whoever had been circling the cabin could have been dangerous. The idea that they had watched me for hours, maybe days, made my skin crawl. I made it to the nearest town before I let myself stop shaking. I checked into a small motel and called the local police, explaining what had happened. They told me they would send a patrol to check the area, but I never went back. Weeks later, I found out that there had been reports of a man living in the forest, someone who had been observed stalking cabins, stealing supplies, and scaring hikers and renters. I realized that I had been lucky, that he had left before he decided to confront me. The relief I felt was immense, but so was the lingering fear. I couldn't imagine what might have happened if I had stayed another night, if I had not been cautious, if I had made one small mistake. Even now, years later, the memory of that trip stays with me. I remember the oppressive quiet of the forest, the sound of leaves cracking underfoot, the shadow moving just out of sight. I remember the feeling of being completely alone and completely exposed, the understanding that the forest is beautiful but also dangerous, and that danger is not always visible. I never went back to that cabin, never tried a remote cabin alone again. I still love the forest, but I am always aware that there are other humans in it, some not friendly, and that reality can be far scarier than any story. I had been looking forward to this trip for months, planning every little detail. I needed a break from everything: the city, the noise, the endless blur of work and responsibilities. I wanted to disappear for a while, to be alone in the woods, to breathe air that didn't smell of exhaust and concrete. The cabin I rented was deep in the forest, far from the nearest road. The photos online made it look perfect. A small wooden cabin with a stone chimney, surrounded by tall pine trees, a creek running just a few meters from the porch. The idea of being cut off from the world excited me. I didn't want distractions, I didn't want people. Just the forest, the silence, and myself. I arrived in the late afternoon. The drive had been long and exhausting, winding over narrow mountain roads, the kind where even one wrong turn could leave you slipping down a cliff. I had packed enough food for a week, a first aid kit, extra batteries, and a small camping stove. My backpack was heavy, but I didn't mind. I wanted to be prepared. When I finally saw the cabin, sunlight filtering through the pine trees, the sight made me breathe easier. It looked exactly like the pictures, maybe even better. The wood was aged, weathered but sturdy, and the smell of pine was heavy in the air. I parked the car at the small clearing in front of the cabin and unloaded my things. The forest around me was dense, the trees so tall and thick that sunlight barely touched the ground. There was a trail leading down to the creek, which I decided to explore later. I entered the cabin and immediately felt a strange mixture of comfort and unease. Everything inside was basic. A small kitchen with a propane stove, a tiny table, 2 chairs, a loft with a bed, and a wood stove. It was clean but had an old, musty smell, the kind that comes from years of being closed off from the world. I set my things down, unpacked my bag, and lit a small fire in the stove. The warmth felt good, but the quiet of the forest outside made the hair on my arms stand up. I spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the area around the cabin. The creek was small but clear, the water moving quickly over smooth rocks. I saw animal tracks near the bank, probably deer, maybe raccoons. The forest felt alive in the right way, calm and quiet, but there was also something oppressive about it, the kind of feeling that comes from knowing you are completely alone. No one could hear you if something went wrong. Night fell faster than I expected. The sky turned deep blue and then black, and the forest around me became almost invisible in the shadows. I ate a simple dinner, heating canned beans over the stove, and then settled in to read a book I had brought. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows, making the trees creak. It was a sound I had always found comforting, but that night it made me uneasy. Every crack of the wood, every rustle of the leaves, seemed louder than normal. Around midnight, I went to the loft to sleep. I had brought a small flashlight with me and a thick blanket. I lay in bed, listening to the forest, and tried to push away the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. I told myself it was just my imagination, that it was normal to feel uneasy when you are completely alone. But as the night deepened, the noises outside seemed to grow closer, sharper. I could hear twigs snapping underfoot, leaves crunching. I told myself it was just animals, maybe a deer moving through the underbrush, but the sound repeated again and again, circling the cabin. I stayed awake for hours, listening. Every now and then, I would shine my flashlight out the small loft window. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the closest trees. Nothing was there. But then, at one point, I saw movement, just a shadow on the far side of the clearing. I froze, heart pounding. It didn't look like an animal. It was upright, moving slowly, keeping to the tree line. I didn't want to believe it, but there was no mistake. Something human-sized was out there, circling the cabin. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the loft, flashlight in hand, listening. I could hear faint, muffled sounds, the crack of a branch, the shuffle of leaves. I thought about trying to call for help, but I had no cell service. The cabin was too deep in the forest for any signal. Panic began to rise in me. I stayed awake until the first signs of dawn, my eyes fixed on the windows, scanning for movement. By morning, the forest was quiet again, the way it should have been, and I started convincing myself that maybe it had been a deer, or a shadow, or my imagination. During the day, I tried to rationalize everything. I collected firewood, filled my water bottles from the creek, and walked around the perimeter of the cabin to see if there were any tracks. I found some, but they were ambiguous. Some could have been animal tracks, some could have been human. But the marks didn't match any pattern I recognized. They looked like someone had been pacing near the cabin. My stomach twisted as I realized that if it had been a person, they might still be around, watching. The next night was worse. I didn't sleep at all. Around 2 a.m., I heard a distinct noise. A scraping sound at the side of the cabin, close to the kitchen window. My heart slammed against my chest. I grabbed a heavy metal flashlight and crept down the ladder to the main floor. I shined the light toward the sound. Nothing. The scraping stopped. I stood there, trembling, listening. Then I heard it again, this time on the other side, near the back door. Someone was trying the doorknob. My hands shook as I grabbed a kitchen knife and pressed myself against the wall. I never imagined that a simple trip to the cabin would turn into one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. I had rented a small, secluded cabin deep in the woods for a week to escape the city and unwind. It was early autumn, and the forest was alive with colors. Reds, oranges, and yellows painting every tree. The drive to the cabin had been long, and the road was narrow and winding, surrounded by dense trees that blocked most of the sunlight. I remember feeling a strange mix of excitement and unease as I parked my car near the cabin. There was no one around, and the nearest neighbor was miles away, according to the owner. The cabin itself looked rustic but solid. It was made of dark timber with a sloped roof and a small porch. I had chosen this cabin for its isolation, wanting nothing more than quiet, the smell of pine, and the crackle of a fire. Inside, it was cozy. A small living area, a kitchenette, a bathroom, and a single bedroom upstairs. The furniture was simple, wooden chairs, a small table, and a couch that looked old but comfortable. I unpacked my things, lit the fireplace, and let myself sink into the solitude I had craved. The first day passed quietly. I explored the surrounding forest, taking long walks along a narrow trail I had found. Birds were chirping, the wind whispered through the trees, and the sun cast long shadows across the forest floor. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful, but I pushed the thought aside. That night, I cooked dinner on the small stove, ate alone, and went to bed early. The silence was comforting at first, but as the night deepened, it became heavy, almost oppressive. Every creak of the cabin made me flinch. I told myself it was just the woods settling, that I was imagining things. The second day, I decided to go deeper into the forest, taking a trail that I hadn't explored before. It was beautiful, but I noticed signs of wildlife everywhere. Broken branches, paw prints, and scattered leaves. It made me uneasy, but I kept going. As I walked, I realized I had lost the trail. The forest around me seemed denser, and the sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long shadows that made everything look unfamiliar. My heart started racing as I tried to retrace my steps, but the more I walked, the more lost I became. By the time I found my way back to the main path, the sun had almost set. I hurried back to the cabin, my mind racing with every sound. The rustle of leaves, the snap of a twig, the distant call of some animal I couldn't see. I locked the cabin door behind me and sat down, trying to calm myself. I realized then that being alone in the woods wasn't as peaceful as I had imagined. It was isolating in a way that made every small sound feel magnified, every shadow a potential threat. The next morning, I woke to find that the weather had changed drastically. A thick fog had rolled in, blanketing the forest and reducing visibility to a few meters. The air was damp and cold, and the forest seemed to have gone silent. I tried to go for a short walk, but the fog made it disorienting. I could barely see the path in front of me, and the trees all looked the same. I decided it was safer to stay inside the cabin and wait for the fog to lift. That evening, while I was chopping wood for the fireplace, I heard it, a faint sound coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind or an animal, but it persisted. It sounded like footsteps on the fallen leaves. I froze, listening. The sound was slow, deliberate, moving closer to the cabin. My mind raced. I was alone, and there was no reason for anyone to be out here. I went to the window and peered through the fog, but I couldn't see anything. The footsteps stopped. I spent the rest of the night on edge, checking the locks, peering out of windows and listening. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of leaves outside, made my heart pound. I realized that isolation in the woods wasn't just about being alone. It was about vulnerability. I was exposed, defenseless, and completely cut off from the world. The following day, I tried to distract myself by exploring the area immediately around the cabin. I noticed things I hadn't before. Broken branches that didn't seem natural, footprints that weren't mine, and a small clearing with signs that someone had been camping recently. My stomach sank. Someone had been near the cabin, and I hadn't known. The realization made me uneasy, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was hunters or hikers or someone else renting nearby. I told myself it was nothing, that I was just imagining danger. That night, the unease returned stronger. I had just finished eating when I heard it again. The sound of footsteps outside. This time it was closer, moving around the cabin. I could hear the crunch of leaves and twigs beneath boots. My pulse quickened, and I felt a cold sweat on my back. I checked the doors and windows, making sure everything was locked. The footsteps circled the cabin for what felt like hours. I didn't sleep that night, sitting by the fireplace with a knife in my hand, listening to every sound. The next morning, I found something alarming. Near the porch, in the dirt, were fresh footprints, boots, larger than mine, heading away from the cabin into the forest. They hadn't been there the day before. My stomach churned. Someone had been outside while I slept. I felt violated, scared in a way I had never experienced before. I considered leaving, but the car was a 20-minute walk down a rough forest path, and I wasn't sure if the person was still nearby. I spent the day barricading the cabin as best as I could. I moved furniture to block windows, checked all the locks, and even tied the door handles with rope. I felt ridiculous, but I needed to feel some sense of control. The forest outside seemed menacing, every tree a potential hiding place. The isolation that had seemed so appealing days ago now felt like a trap. That evening, I noticed another sign. Small marks on the cabin wall near the back door, scratches that hadn't been there before. My hands shook as I examined them. Someone had been close, possibly trying to see if anyone was inside. I realized then that the person had probably been watching me for days, maybe since I arrived. Panic set in. I considered calling the police, but there was no cell signal. I had no way to communicate, no way to get help. The reality of my vulnerability hit me harder than anything I had imagined. The nights became unbearable. Each sound outside made me jump. Each shadow made me spin around. I rarely slept, dozing off only when exhaustion took over, my hand never far from the knife on the table beside me. I spent hours looking out the windows, straining to see through the darkness and fog. I became hyper-aware of everything: the wind, the leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. Every small noise made my heart race. Then, one night, something happened that changed everything. I had just settled by the fire, trying to force myself to sleep, when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of someone trying to open the front door. It was quiet, deliberate, and precise. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. The knob rattled slightly, then stopped. I backed away, knife in hand, and slowly moved toward the door. The sound returned, louder this time. Someone was trying to get in. I had no choice. I ran to the back, grabbing a heavy chair and placing it against the door. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I looked around the cabin, realizing that there was nowhere to hide effectively. I had to act, and I had to act fast. I remembered the small window in the bathroom. It was tiny, but I could squeeze through it if I had to. My plan formed quickly. If the intruder got in, I would escape through the window and run to the car, no matter what. Hours passed, or maybe minutes, it was impossible to tell. Every sound made me tense. Finally, as dawn approached, the footsteps and rattling stopped. I waited until the sun had risen, casting light into the cabin before I dared to move. The forest outside looked empty, deceptively calm. I cautiously opened the door and stepped outside. There were no signs of the intruder, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I decided I couldn't stay another night. I packed quickly, leaving as little behind as possible, and made my way down the rough forest path to my car. Every sound made me flinch, but I kept moving. I reached the car, jumped in, and locked the doors. As I drove away, the relief was overwhelming. I didn't look back. The cabin, the forest, and the terror I had felt receded in the rearview mirror, but the memory of being completely exposed and alone stayed with me. When I returned home, I contacted the local authorities. They came to the cabin a few days later. There were signs that someone had been living rough in the area. A makeshift campsite, remnants of food, and footprints leading in and out of the forest, but no one was ever caught. I learned that the forest had a history of transient campers, some of whom had criminal records, and it was possible that I had unknowingly stumbled into someone's territory. It took weeks for me to stop looking over my shoulder, for the constant feeling of being watched to fade. I realized how fragile my sense of security had been, how easily someone could violate it when I was isolated. The experience left me shaken, but it also made me more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. I had survived, and that was the most important thing. The memory of fear stayed with me, but it was tempered by relief and gratitude for my safety. I never went back to that cabin. I never forgot the silence, the isolation, the sound of footsteps outside, or the feeling of being completely alone in a world that suddenly felt dangerous. But I also learned that careful preparation, awareness, and quick thinking could save me when faced with real danger. The cabin, the forest, and the terror I experienced became a story I carried with me, a reminder of vulnerability, resilience, and the sharp edge between comfort and fear. I had chosen this cabin for its isolation. It was far from the nearest town, nestled deep in the forest where the trees were thick and the ground uneven. The dirt road leading to it had been overgrown in places, forcing me to slow down and pick my way carefully through mud and roots. I had driven for hours, leaving behind the hum of highways, the glare of streetlights, and the constant presence of other people. I wanted silence and I wanted solitude, and at first the quiet felt like a relief. There was no one around, just the wind moving through the tall pines and the occasional snap of a branch under my own feet. The cabin was small, built from dark wood that had begun to weather with time, but solid and sturdy. Its roof sagged slightly, and the windows had layers of grime that made it hard to see inside. I parked my car near the side of the cabin, where the ground was slightly flatter, and stepped out. The air was sharp, smelling of wet leaves, moss, and pine resin. I could see my breath in the cool evening air. The first thing I noticed inside the cabin was how dark it was. The windows let in very little light, and the single lamp in the corner didn't work. Dust hung in the air like a fog. There were cobwebs in the corners, and the floor creaked with every step I took. I had come prepared with a small flashlight which I used to explore. The cabin had a living area, a small kitchen, and a narrow loft above that I planned to sleep in. The furniture was sparse, a couple of chairs, a rough wooden table, and a bed in the loft that looked like it had seen better days. I set down my bag and opened my supplies, unpacking food, blankets, and a small first aid kit. I had also brought a knife, a sturdy one, just in case. It wasn't that I expected trouble, but something about being alone in the forest made me uneasy. I spent the next hour securing the cabin as best I could. I checked the windows and doors, making sure each could be latched tightly. The locks were old and worn, but they would slow anyone down if necessary. I stacked some firewood near the hearth and set a small pile of kindling to dry out, planning to start a fire once it grew fully dark. As I moved through the cabin, I became aware of how quiet it really was. There were no birds singing, no insects buzzing, no wind brushing through the treetops. Even the forest floor outside seemed to hold its breath. The deeper the light faded outside, the more I felt the silence pressing against the walls of the cabin. It was a heavy, almost physical weight, one that made my skin crawl. By the time night had fallen completely, the darkness outside was so thick I could no longer see the shapes of trees or rocks. I managed to get the fire going, small at first but growing as the wood caught. The warmth was comforting, but it only emphasized the chill of the corners of the cabin where the fire's light didn't reach. Shadows danced across the walls, stretching and twisting as the flames licked the wooden beams. I ate a simple dinner from my supplies, listening to the crackle of the fire and the occasional pop of resin in the logs. That's when I first noticed the sound. It was faint at first, like someone stepping on dead leaves outside. I froze, straining my ears, and the sound stopped. My heart had begun to beat faster, a rhythm that matched the rise and fall of the firelight. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, and I tried to ignore it. Hours passed, and the cabin grew colder despite the fire. I wrapped myself in blankets in the loft, trying to read from a small notebook I had brought, documenting my thoughts, my routine, and the experience of being entirely alone. Every now and then, the noises from outside returned. The rustle of branches, the snap of twigs, and once, a low thump that sounded heavier than any animal I had encountered before. I stayed still, listening, my knife resting across my lap. Eventually, I drifted into a light, uneasy sleep, the fire burning down to embers below. I woke in the middle of the night to a different sound. It was a scraping, slow and deliberate, coming from outside the cabin. My chest tightened, and I stayed frozen, listening. The noise moved around the side of the cabin, and then it stopped. I didn't dare make a sound, didn't dare shine my flashlight. The darkness outside seemed almost alive, pressing against the windows and doors. The thought that someone or something could be out there, moving silently, filled me with a cold panic. I considered leaving, but the forest was a maze, and I didn't know if I could find my car without a flashlight or risk getting lost in the dark. The safest place was the cabin. By dawn, the noises had stopped. The wind returned to the forest, and the birds began to stir. I felt exhausted, hollowed out by the fear of the night, but I couldn't stay in bed any longer. I went down to check the cabin. Nothing seemed disturbed. No footprints in the mud outside, no broken branches, no evidence that anyone had actually been near. Yet, in the back of my mind, I knew I hadn't imagined it. The sounds had been real, deliberate, too heavy to be just an animal. I spent the morning securing the cabin again, reinforcing the windows with spare boards I found in a shed out back, tying the door shut with rope. I felt a strange satisfaction in this, a small measure of control over a situation that had nearly broken me the night before. I didn't realize how isolated the cabin really was until I was halfway up the winding dirt road that led to it. I had driven for hours through narrow, uneven mountain roads, the car bouncing over potholes and loose stones, the engine grumbling against the incline. I had passed a few signs warning about steep grades and falling rocks, and I had laughed at them, thinking they were exaggerations, meant for people who weren't used to driving in hilly terrain. Now, with the trees growing denser on either side and the light fading quickly, I began to wonder if I had made a mistake. The cabin had been rented online, a last-minute decision fueled by the need to get away from everything. The noise, the work, the endless stream of small obligations that made life feel suffocating. Pictures online had made it look inviting. Wooden, rustic, with a stone fireplace and large windows overlooking the forest. It had seemed quiet, peaceful. Now, as I neared it, I realized that the word peaceful had a weight I hadn't considered. Peaceful here was the absence of human life, the kind of quiet where even the smallest noises seemed amplified. The crunch of gravel under my tires, the wind in the branches, the distant rustle of what could have been animals, or maybe just the wind again. When I finally reached the cabin, my heart was still racing from the drive. It sat on a small clearing, slightly elevated, with a dirt path leading up to a wooden porch. The exterior was aged, the wood weathered gray, and the roof sagged slightly in one corner. It had no other cabins nearby, no visible signs of life, no fences or lights, just the forest pressing close on all sides. I parked the car beside the porch and stepped out, stretching my stiff legs, trying to shake off the tension. The air was cold and smelled of damp earth, pine, and something else, something faintly metallic that I couldn't place. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, and the interior smelled of dust, wood polish, and a faint, sour tang that reminded me of damp basements. The cabin had a small living room with a stone fireplace, a narrow hallway leading to one bedroom, and a tiny kitchen with a sink and a couple of cabinets. The furniture was sparse. An old sofa, a small wooden table with 2 chairs, and a few shelves lined with books whose spines were faded and cracked. The windows were large, letting in the dimming light, and I could see the tops of trees and the deepening shadows outside. I had intended to stay only one night, but the thought of leaving so soon now made me feel uneasy. There was no cell signal here, no Wi-Fi, nothing but the cabin and the surrounding forest. It was exactly what I had wanted, but now it felt like I had stepped into a trap. I unpacked quickly, putting a few clothes in the small closet and arranging my backpack on the bed. The cabin was silent except for the occasional creak of the wooden floor and the soft whistle of the wind outside. I decided to light the fireplace. The wood had been stacked neatly beside it, dry and cracked. Striking a match, I set the kindling ablaze, watching the flames grow, the warmth slowly filling the room. Shadows danced across the walls, stretching and shrinking as the fire flickered. I sat in one of the chairs, staring at the flames, feeling a mix of relief and unease. Relief that there was warmth, light, and a moment of normalcy. Unease that I was completely alone in a place so quiet, so removed from the world. Hours passed. I ate a small dinner of canned food and bread, the metallic taste of the food clashing with the faintly sour air of the cabin. Outside, the wind grew stronger. Branches scraped against the walls, and the distant sound of falling rocks echoed faintly, carried by the night. I tried to distract myself by looking through the books on the shelf. Most were old and unreadable, their pages yellowed and brittle. A few were travel guides, maps of local trails, and old nature photography books. I flipped through them slowly, the crackle of the fireplace the only other sound in the room. It was well past midnight when I finally went to bed. The bedroom was small, with a single bed, a wooden dresser, and a narrow window overlooking the forest. I pulled the blankets over me, the chill of the night air still clinging to the corners of the room. Sleep came fitfully. I kept waking at odd intervals, the silence of the cabin pressing against my ears. Every small noise, the groan of the floorboards, the whistle of the wind, the occasional snap of a branch outside, made my heart jump. I tried to tell myself it was all natural, that it was just the forest, the age of the cabin, the wind, but my body refused to relax fully. Around 2 a.m., I woke to a louder sound than before. A thump coming from outside. It was distant at first, then repeated, closer this time, as if something was moving near the cabin. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I strained to see through the window. The forest was black, shapes indistinct, but I could just make out movement. Shadows shifting unnaturally fast, too deliberate to be just the wind. I felt a rush of panic. I had told myself repeatedly that I was alone, that there was no one else here, but the sound continued, now accompanied by a scraping noise, like nails or claws against wood. I didn't know what to do. The door was locked, but that didn't feel like enough. I remembered the old axe hanging on the wall by the fireplace, probably intended for chopping wood. I grabbed it, holding it tightly, feeling its weight, trying to calm myself with the thought that it was at least something. I crept to the window, looking out, but the shadows moved just out of sight. The thumping stopped for a moment, then resumed, now louder, closer. My stomach nodded. Whoever or whatever was out there seemed to know I was inside. I spent the rest of the night in that bedroom, clutching the axe, listening. Every small noise made me flinch. The wind, the branches, the occasional distant animal all sounded like threats. Couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about the drive back, how long it would take, the steep roads in the dark. The forest seemed alive with possibilities, with threats, and I felt trapped, a prisoner of my own decision to come here. Morning came slowly. The first light revealed nothing outside the window, just the same dense forest. The air was cold, and dew covered the clearing. I forced myself to get up, to move around, to see if anything had happened overnight. The porch had scuff marks, small depressions in the dirt near the cabin's edge, but nothing definitive. No clear footprints, no signs of forced entry. I told myself it had been a dream, a product of my imagination. The fear was real, but maybe the danger had been imagined. I spent the rest of the night in that bedroom, clutching the axe, listening. Every small noise made me flinch. The wind, the branches, the occasional distant animal all sounded like threats. Couldn't sleep. I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about the drive back, how long it would take, the steep roads in the dark. The forest seemed alive with possibilities, with threats, and I felt trapped, a prisoner of my own decision to come here. Morning came slowly. The first light revealed nothing outside the window, just the same dense forest. The air was cold, and dew covered the clearing. I forced myself to get up, to move around, to see if anything had happened overnight. The porch had scuff marks, small depressions in the dirt near the cabin's edge, but nothing definitive. No clear footprints, no signs of forced entry. I told myself it had been a dream, a product of my imagination. The fear was real, but maybe the danger had been imagined. I spent the day cautiously exploring the surrounding area. The cabin sat at the edge of a dense forest, with a narrow trail winding down the hill. I walked the path slowly, listening, watching, but saw no one. Animal tracks, mostly deer and small mammals, crisscrossed the dirt, and I found signs of birds and squirrels, but nothing human. The isolation was eerie, and my sense of relief was partial at best. I kept checking behind me, expecting to see movement in the trees, but saw nothing. That night was quieter, though my nerves remained frayed. I stayed near the fireplace, keeping the axe close, listening to the wind and the occasional night animal. Sleep came slowly in short, uneasy bursts. When I woke in the morning, I resolved to leave. I couldn't stay another night with the tension, the fear, and the uncertainty. The drive back down the mountain would be difficult in the dark, so I packed quickly, checked the cabin thoroughly, and loaded my car. The trip down was tense. Every shadow, every branch scraping against the car sounded menacing. I kept the windows up and the doors locked. I drove cautiously, stopping several times to look back, to make sure no one was following me. The road was rough, and my hands ached from gripping the wheel so tightly. The forest seemed endless, the hills relentless, until finally I reached a paved road, then a small town, then civilization. The feeling of relief was immense. The town had lights, people, cars, and the normal sounds of life. I stopped at a diner for breakfast. The warmth of the room, the smell of coffee and bacon, and the presence of strangers a comfort beyond words. I thought about the cabin, about the noises, the shadows, the fear that had gripped me. It had been real, visceral, frightening, but now I could process it. The isolation had magnified every sound, every movement, every thought. I had been safe, but the cabin, the forest, the darkness had made me feel otherwise. Over the next few days, I reflected on the experience. The fear had been exhausting, but it had also taught me something about myself. My limits, my reactions, my capacity for vigilance. I had survived, and in surviving, I had gained a strange sense of clarity. I realized that isolation was a tool, one that sharpened senses, tested courage, and forced confrontation with oneself. I had faced my fear, endured it, and come out on the other side. Eventually, I returned to my normal life, but the memory of the cabin stayed with me. It reminded me of the power of the natural world, of solitude, and of fear. I never went back, and I don't plan to, but I carry the experience with me. The cold nights, the rustling shadows, the weight of silence, and the relief of returning to the world of light, noise, and human presence. I understood then, more than ever, the value of preparedness, awareness, and respect for nature's power. The cabin had been terrifying, yes, but it had also been a test I had survived, and that survival left me with a sense of accomplishment and a deep, quiet respect for the wild world outside the walls of civilization. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea of spending a week alone in a remote cabin in the mountains sounded perfect. The kind of peace that comes from being far away from people, the constant noise of traffic, the endless notifications, the fluorescent lights, none of it would be there. I wanted silence, I wanted isolation, and I wanted to remind myself that I could handle being completely alone for an extended period. The cabin I rented was small, old, and completely off-grid. There was no electricity, no internet, and no phone signal. The owner had warned me that if anything went wrong, it could take hours for anyone to reach me. That had only made me more determined. I packed my backpack carefully. A small stove, a few cans of food, a gallon of water, batteries, candles, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and enough clothes for a week in unpredictable mountain weather. I double-checked everything, even making sure I had extra matches and a sturdy knife. The drive up the mountain was long and winding. At first, the road was paved, cutting through fields and patches of forest, but as I got closer, it narrowed and turned into dirt and gravel. The trees grew taller, denser, and the air changed, cooler, heavier, and carrying the smell of pine. By the time I arrived, the sun was beginning to dip behind the mountain peaks, casting long shadows that made everything look sharper, stranger, and somehow lonelier. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by trees that stretched tall and tight against each other, forming a natural wall around the clearing. It was made of rough logs, darkened by age and weather. The roof had some missing shingles, and a small chimney leaned slightly to one side. A wooden porch wrapped around the front, with a railing that looked fragile. I parked my car next to the cabin and got out. The air was crisp, and the silence was thick. I carried my backpack up the steps and unlocked the door. The smell of old wood and dust hit me immediately. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small living area with a table and 2 chairs, a kitchenette with a sink and a wood stove, a tiny bedroom with a narrow bed, and a small bathroom with a tub. Everything was worn but functional. I unpacked my things, made a small fire in the stove, and prepared a simple dinner from my canned food. First, everything felt fine. I walked around the clearing, exploring the perimeter of the cabin. The trees were close, and I could hear the faint rustle of wildlife in the underbrush. Birds, squirrels, maybe a deer. It was the kind of quiet that made you hyper-aware of every sound. That night, I slept uneasily. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, every distant crack of a branch in the forest seemed amplified. I told myself it was normal, that the mountains had their own language, but sleep was fitful. The next morning, I woke early, feeling restless but determined to make the most of the day. I decided to hike along a trail the owner had mentioned, a path that looped through the forest and eventually led to a small stream. The trail started well enough. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and the path underfoot was soft with fallen pine needles. I moved slowly, enjoying the sense of solitude, but after a while, I realized I hadn't seen any signs of human presence for a long stretch. No footprints, no litter, no sounds beyond the wind and the occasional bird. That unease crept in, the same unease I had felt at night, but I shrugged it off, attributing it to my imagination. Hours into the hike, the trail became less distinct. Rocks and roots jutted up from the earth, and the path seemed to split and twist without any clear direction. I checked my map, but it wasn't detailed enough to help me pinpoint exactly where I was. I had a compass, but even following it, the terrain felt endless and indistinguishable. I pressed on, thinking I could circle back if needed. That's when I first noticed the footprints. They were faint, partially obscured by leaves, but definitely human. What struck me immediately was that they were large and heavy, the kind of footprints someone wearing boots would leave. I felt a surge of unease, but told myself it could be anyone. A hunter, a ranger, someone else hiking. Still, a part of me knew I hadn't expected anyone to be on this trail at this time of day. I continued hiking, trying not to dwell on it. The stream was supposed to be nearby, but as I followed the footprints, the forest grew denser. The sun was sinking lower, and the temperature dropped sharply. By the time I realized it, I was lost. The trail had disappeared entirely, and I couldn't recognize any landmarks. Panic set in slowly. I had thought I was prepared, but suddenly the isolation felt suffocating. I could hear the faint snap of twigs behind me. My heart jumped. I spun around, but there was nothing, just the trees swaying in the wind. I tried to calm myself, telling myself I was imagining things. I retraced my steps, hoping to find the trail again, but everything looked the same. The shadows were growing long and dark, merging the trees into massive black shapes. I walked for hours, stumbling over roots and rocks, my flashlight battery dimming. The footprints kept appearing, sometimes ahead of me, sometimes behind, but never consistent. They made no sense. Some were massive, some smaller, but all human. I started hearing rustling more clearly, not far away. I thought about shouting for help, but there was no one to hear me. My phone had no signal, and even if it did, I had no way of telling anyone exactly where I was. Night fell completely, and the temperature dropped sharply. I realized I hadn't packed enough layers for a night spent wandering in the forest. I had to find shelter. Eventually, I came across a small clearing with a fallen log that looked relatively dry. I used my remaining flashlight to inspect the area. There was a rock outcropping nearby that could shield me from wind and rain. I gathered some dry wood and managed to light a small fire. The flames were comforting, but the darkness surrounding me was oppressive. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a branch made me tense. I couldn't tell if it was an animal or something else. I huddled close to the fire, trying to stay calm and conserve energy. Sleep came in fits and starts, broken by every noise, every shadow. The next morning, I realized that I had no idea where I was in relation to the cabin. I tried to backtrack using the compass, but the forest had no clear reference points. I spent the day moving slowly, trying to follow the sun, hoping it would help me find a familiar landmark. Hunger and thirst were starting to affect me. My water supply was low, and I had barely eaten anything the previous day. The stress, fear, and exhaustion made it hard to think clearly. Around mid-afternoon, I stumbled into another small clearing. There was a narrow dirt road, barely visible beneath fallen leaves and overgrowth. I realized with a jolt that this might connect to the main trail or even lead back to the cabin. I followed it cautiously, my senses heightened. That's when I saw something that froze me in place. Tracks, fresh tracks, leading directly along the road, too large for me to ignore. Someone had been there recently. My mind raced. Was it a hunter, a lost hiker, or someone who shouldn't be there? I tried to slow my breathing and assess the situation. I decided to keep moving, staying close to the edge of the road, using trees for cover. Hours later, as the sun dipped low again, I saw the outline of the cabin through the trees. Relief flooded me so strongly it nearly knocked me over. I ran toward it, my legs burning, my heart pounding. I reached the cabin as darkness settled fully around the clearing. I checked the locks, secured all the doors and windows, and tried to light a fire in the stove. Every sound outside made me jump, but I eventually convinced myself that I was safe, at least safer than in the forest. That night, I stayed up for hours, listening to the forest. The rustling continued, faint at first, then closer. I peered through the windows but saw nothing beyond the dark outlines of the trees. Exhaustion eventually forced me to sleep, but only lightly, one ear tuned to every sound. The next morning, I decided to stay in the cabin until someone arrived or until I could safely make it down the mountain. I rationed my food and water carefully and reinforced the cabin's perimeter as best I could. 2 days later, I heard a vehicle on the dirt road. I ran outside to wave it down. A ranger stopped, concerned by the tire tracks and footprints around the cabin. I explained what had happened, and he listened carefully, taking notes. The next day, he and a colleague helped me follow the trail I had taken. They confirmed my fears. Someone had been following me in the forest, likely camping or hiding near the trails. The footprints, the disturbed underbrush, all suggested a person had been observing me for hours, possibly trying to intimidate me or worse. The idea made my skin crawl, but I was grateful to be alive. After that experience, I never went back to the cabin. The isolation that had once drawn me there now felt dangerous. I had been lucky by chance, by timing, and by the fact that whoever had been out there didn't escalate things. But the lesson stayed with me. Nature is unpredictable, and solitude, while beautiful, can be terrifying when you're not prepared for the unknown. I learned to respect the wilderness in a way I hadn't before, to prepare meticulously, and to never underestimate the potential presence of other humans in the remotest places. It had been a terrifying experience, but the clear ending, the relief of returning safely, the help from the ranger, and the knowledge that I had survived, was something I carried with me long after. The memory stayed vivid, a constant reminder of how fragile safety can feel when you are truly alone. I stayed completely still, holding my breath. Hours passed. The footsteps eventually faded, and the first hint of dawn brought relief. But I knew I couldn't stay longer. I packed my things quickly, checking for any signs of intrusion. Everything inside seemed untouched, though the sense of being watched lingered. Driving back was tense. Every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch made me glance into the forest, expecting to see someone following. I stuck to the main roads and avoided side paths, not wanting to risk encountering whoever or whatever had been near the cabin. When I finally reached a small town, I felt a wave of relief. People, cars, lights, it was overwhelming after the isolation, but comforting. Looking back, the cabin had been exactly what I wanted, remote, quiet, isolated. But it also had reminded me how alone and vulnerable I could be in the woods. It was a scary, humbling experience, one that I wouldn't repeat without precautions. I had survived, and the sense of safety in human surroundings felt more real than ever. The cabin remained in my memory, not as a place of relaxation, but as a reminder that the forest could be beautiful, quiet, and terrifying all at once. From that trip, I learned a few things that stayed with me. Always tell someone where you're going. Always trust your instincts. And above all, isolation in nature is not the same as peace. It is vulnerability, and it demands respect. Even now, months later, I still think about that cabin. The smell of the wood, the cold of the night, the echo of footsteps on the dirt. It feels like a distant memory, but also a warning I carry with me. I returned to the city, but the sense of alertness and awareness from that weekend never left me. Nature is beautiful, but it is never forgiving, and I understood more than ever how quickly something can feel safe and suddenly become dangerous. I had been driving for hours along a narrow, winding forest road. The trees on either side were dense, their bare branches twisting in odd directions as if the forest itself were alive, and the late autumn sunlight barely filtered through, casting long, uneven shadows across the road. I had no one with me. Just me, my old SUV, and a map I had printed from an outdated website that promised a secluded cabin rental deep in the forest, far from the chaos of the city. The thought of quiet and isolation had drawn me in. I wanted to escape everything for a weekend, to sit by a fire, read, and just be alone. The map had seemed straightforward at first, but soon the road narrowed to dirt, then gravel, and finally to what was little more than a rutted track. My tires slipped over loose rocks and patches of damp earth, and I realized I was far deeper into the woods than I had anticipated. Each turn seemed to take me further away from civilization. My phone's signal had vanished long ago, leaving only the occasional flicker of no service in the corner of the screen. My stomach tightened with unease, but I told myself it was normal to feel a little nervous in the woods. After all, I had driven here willingly, knowing I would be alone. Finally, after what felt like endless twisting roads and hairpin turns, I saw it, the cabin, a small, weathered structure sitting on a slight rise in the forest. It was modest, made of rough-hewn logs with a sloping roof and a single stone chimney. A thin column of smoke drifted lazily from the chimney, suggesting it was used recently, though I could see no other signs of life. I parked my SUV on the uneven dirt just in front of the cabin and climbed out. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the earthy smell of decaying leaves and pine. I approached the cabin cautiously, noting the faint sound of wind moving through the trees and the occasional creak of the wooden structure settling. The door was slightly ajar, and I pushed it open. The smell of wood smoke and dust hit me immediately. The interior was small and simple. One main room with a rough wooden table, a small kitchen area, a stone fireplace, and a staircase leading to a loft. Everything was worn but functional. I ran my fingers over the surfaces, feeling the grooves and rough patches in the wood, and told myself I would clean up later. I unpacked my bag and laid out some basic supplies I had brought. A small bag of food, a flashlight, a first aid kit, and extra blankets. I wanted to feel comfortable, so I started a small fire in the fireplace, carefully stacking logs and striking a match. The fire caught quickly, the flames crackling and warming the space. For a moment, everything felt perfect. The isolation, the quiet, the smell of burning wood. It was exactly what I had hoped for. As the sun dipped lower, the shadows in the cabin grew longer, stretching across the walls and floor. I moved to the small loft to set up my sleeping area. The loft was barely large enough for a thin mattress, but it had a low railing and a small window that looked out over the forest. I lay down for a moment, listening to the sounds of the trees, the distant rustle of what I assumed were small animals. Night fell quickly. The forest outside became a wall of darkness, broken only by the faint flicker of the fire through the cabin window. I had a few candles I had brought, which I lit to add a softer glow. As I sat there, the feeling of being completely alone in the woods began to sink in. It was different from city loneliness. Here, I could hear every small sound. The snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of what might have been a coyote or wolf. My heart started to beat a little faster, but I told myself it was normal. Later, I noticed something odd. The cabin door, which I was certain I had locked, was slightly open again. I froze, staring at it, then slowly got up and checked the latch. It was closed properly. My mind tried to rationalize it. Perhaps I hadn't shut it fully before. I tightened the lock and moved back toward the fireplace, trying to shake the unease. But then I heard it. A soft, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the dirt just outside. I froze again, listening. The steps stopped, and then silence. I tried to stay calm. I had my flashlight, and I could see outside through the window, but the darkness was complete beyond the small circle of light from the fire. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer, but something about the sound had been wrong. Too deliberate, too slow, like someone was testing the ground. I moved closer to the loft window and looked out. Nothing, just black trees and the faint outlines of branches. The rest of the night passed slowly. I stayed awake, keeping the fire alive, listening for any sound. Every snap of a branch made me tense. Every gust of wind rattled the cabin boards and made me flinch. Sleep was impossible, and when dawn finally arrived, it brought little comfort. The forest looked no less intimidating in the daylight. I decided to leave the cabin and explore the area during the day, hoping sunlight would make me feel safer. I walked the small perimeter around the cabin. There were signs that someone had been there recently. Discarded wrappers, footprints that weren't mine, a small fire pit that looked newer than the cabin itself. My stomach sank. I hadn't expected anyone else, especially not in such a remote place. The feeling of unease I had tried to suppress at night returned full force. I realized I had to be careful. I didn't know who or what might be out here. I spent the day exploring cautiously, keeping the cabin in sight. The forest was dense, and I realized how easy it would be to get lost. I marked my path with small sticks and rocks so I could find my way back. The hours passed slowly. Each sound, birds, squirrels, wind, kept my senses alert. I gathered firewood and tried to make the cabin feel safer, checking the door and windows repeatedly. That night, I slept a little better, though not much. I stayed in the loft with a knife and flashlight within reach. Around midnight, the steps returned. This time, I was ready. I didn't open the door, but I watched the faint glow of the firelight against the darkness outside. The footsteps moved closer, circling the cabin. Something about their rhythm was unnerving. I realized it wasn't an animal. I could tell the difference. I had been planning this solo cabin trip for months, ever since I first saw the listing online. It was tucked deep in the northern woods, a small, rustic place, far from any town or road, surrounded by nothing but trees and the slow, steady sounds of nature. The kind of place that promised solitude and quiet, away from the constant buzz of work, traffic, and people. At first, the idea of spending a week alone in the woods thrilled me. I imagined waking up to the sun filtering through the pines, cooking over a small stove, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee, reading and just being. But the reality of it was far more intense than I had expected. More gripping, more terrifying, and more exhausting than I could have imagined. I drove for hours through winding, poorly marked forest roads, the GPS barely holding a signal, the map showing only faint, broken lines for trails. The last 10 miles were on a dirt path, rutted and uneven, with rocks and puddles that slowed my progress to a crawl. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low in the sky, burning orange and red through the dense canopy. The place was small, built of dark timber logs, with a single porch and a narrow stone chimney. It looked sturdy, but abandoned, like no one had set foot there for months. I parked my car on the uneven ground and unloaded my gear. Backpack, food, water, lanterns, extra batteries, first aid kit, and tools. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of damp pine and earth. Inside, the cabin was simple but functional. A small kitchen area with a sink and stove, a table, and a few shelves. There were 2 beds with thin mattresses, a wood-burning stove, and a stack of firewood. The walls were bare except for some hooks and an old, faded calendar. I moved through the space, checking doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. Despite my careful inspection, the place felt off. It wasn't supernatural or ghostly, just a kind of emptiness that made my skin prickle. I shrugged it off as nerves, convincing myself that the isolation alone was enough to make anyone feel uneasy. That first night, I started a fire in the stove and ate a simple dinner. I listened to the wind rustling through the trees, the occasional crack of a branch snapping in the distance. The noises were normal, I told myself. Wildlife, falling branches. But my mind couldn't stop tracing shapes in the darkness beyond the windows. I double-checked the locks, even though the cabin was miles from any road. I fell asleep with the lantern on, casting a soft glow, my backpack by the bed, ready in case I needed to move quickly. The next day, I decided to explore the immediate area. The woods were dense, the ground uneven, thick with moss and fallen leaves. I followed a narrow trail along a creek, the water cold and clear, reflecting the gray sky. Birds flitted through the trees, and I saw a deer drinking at the water's edge, freezing as I watched before bounding away. Everything seemed normal, almost serene, but as the day went on, I began to notice subtle signs that unsettled me. There were footprints, not human, not like any deer or dog, larger, deeper, and oddly spaced. I tracked them for a short distance, noting the size and irregularity. They stopped suddenly, as if whoever or whatever made them had vanished. I shook off the unease and returned to the cabin, but the feeling lingered, a gnawing sense of being watched. That night, the wind picked up, shaking the trees and rattling the cabin. I sat by the stove, sharpening my knife and organizing my supplies, trying to keep my mind occupied. Around midnight, I heard it, a low, dragging sound outside, like something heavy being pulled over the dirt and leaves. My heart leapt into my throat. I froze, straining to listen. The sound stopped suddenly, replaced by the subtle scuffle of smaller feet, or claws, moving through the underbrush. I remembered the prints from earlier, and a cold knot formed in my stomach. I checked all the windows and doors. They were locked. I sat with the knife on my lap, listening for hours, until exhaustion finally overcame me. Over the next few days, I tried to maintain routine. I chopped wood, gathered water, kept the stove going, and explored cautiously. But the sense of being watched didn't abate. I found more tracks, larger and deeper each time. Sometimes they would appear close to the cabin, disappearing into the trees. On one morning, I stepped outside to find claw marks gouged into the side of the cabin, jagged and uneven, deep enough to leave splinters in the air. I froze, scanning the forest. Nothing moved, but the presence was undeniable. My initial excitement for solitude had turned into a constant, grinding anxiety. I had no cell signal, no way to call for help, and no way to know if whatever was out there would attack or was merely curious. Food became a source of tension. I stored everything in the small pantry, but I would often find it disturbed. A bag of rice opened slightly, a can knocked over, the lid scuffed. My rational mind tried to reason it away. Animals, squirrels, raccoons, but the tracks didn't match any ordinary animal. They were too large, too deliberate, and always seemed to appear just outside the cabin, circling, studying. I started sleeping with the firewood near my bed, and my knife within reach. I even built a barricade of sorts at the door, moving heavy furniture in front of it. The forest felt alive, not with birds and deer, but with a quiet, calculating presence that shadowed every step I took. I woke around 3 in the morning. Something felt wrong immediately. The cabin was quiet now. The wind had died down, but there was an oppressive stillness. I heard a low thud from outside, then another and another coming from the clearing around the cabin. My body went rigid. I stayed in bed, listening. Then I realized the sound wasn't random. It was deliberate. Something was moving outside, circling the cabin, heavy footsteps breaking twigs and crunching leaves. I slowly reached for my rifle, keeping my body as still as possible. My mind raced through every possible scenario. Wild animal, human intruder, hallucination from exhaustion, but none of it felt right. I could hear breathing outside, faint but real, and then the scratching started again, closer this time. I tried to remind myself of logic. The cabin had locks, the windows were small, it would be hard for someone to get in without making noise. But that didn't stop the panic rising in my chest. I thought about the nearest road, the 3 hours to town, the phone service that was patchy at best. If someone tried to break in, I was completely on my own. My hands shook as I grabbed my hatchet off the table beside the bed and crept to the window. Peering into the darkness, I could barely make out shapes moving among the trees. The flashlight I had brought was sitting on the table. I considered turning it on to see, but that would announce my presence. Whatever was out there, it was waiting, watching. Hours passed. The footsteps and scratching continued, intermittent, always moving around the cabin. I stayed in the loft, gripping my hatchet, too scared to move. Sleep was impossible. Dawn couldn't come soon enough. When the first gray light seeped through the trees, I finally got a clear view. There was a figure, human, thin, moving cautiously among the trees, lingering near the edge of the clearing. My heart sank. It wasn't an animal. Someone had been watching the cabin all night. I spent the day fortifying the cabin. I checked the locks on the doors, barricaded the windows as best I could with furniture, and prepared my weapons. I stayed mostly inside, peeking out when the figure moved farther away. I kept telling myself I had to survive until nightfall or until someone came by accident, but I realized I had no way to call for help if the intruder returned closer. Every sound in the forest now made my stomach twist. A branch snapping, leaves rustling, distant bird calls. I ate sparingly, drank water, and tried to stay calm, but every hour stretched endlessly. My mind kept replaying every horror story I'd ever heard about cabin intrusions, and I couldn't stop the fear from creeping into every thought. By evening, the figure had left, or at least I could no longer see it. I knew better than to assume it was gone. Whoever it was had learned about the cabin, probably tracked me from the main road, and now they knew I was alone. I stayed awake all night, rifle in hand, watching for shadows. The isolation was crushing. Every noise made me tense. Every gust of wind sounded like someone approaching. I didn't know if I would survive the next night. The fear had grown heavy and constant, a physical weight pressing on my chest. Morning finally came again. Exhausted, I waited until the intruder's figure was gone from the clearing and then made my decision. I would not stay another night. I packed my things as quietly as I could, every movement deliberate. I waited for the intruder to be far enough into the forest, and then I slipped out of the cabin, heart hammering, and made a beeline for the car. Every step through the underbrush felt louder than it should have. Every rustle and snap of a twig made me jump. I kept my head low, moving quickly but cautiously. When I finally reached the gravel path and started the car, I didn't look back. I drove slowly at first, ears straining for any signs of pursuit, then faster as the forest thinned and the main road appeared. The whole way to town, my hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they ached, and every glance in the rearview mirror made me flinch, expecting to see someone emerging from the trees. When I finally reached civilization, I stopped at a gas station and called the police. They said they could investigate, but with no clear evidence or description, there was little they could do. I didn't care. I wanted safety more than justice. I stayed in a hotel that night, too exhausted to sleep until morning. Eventually, the tension faded slowly, replaced by relief and disbelief that I had made it out without confrontation. The cabin, once a dream of solitude, had become a place of terror. I never went back, and I made a promise to myself. Isolation in the wilderness was not something I would ever seek again without proper safety measures. Even now, months later, I still think about that cabin, that night, and the figure in the trees. I know what I experienced was real, and I survived because I stayed alert, stayed logical, and got out when I still could. The forest is beautiful, but it is also unforgiving. I learned that sometimes solitude can be more dangerous than the wildest predator, and that humans can be the scariest threat of all. That night, I stayed awake all hours, listening, watching the shadows beyond the windows. The intruder was patient, moving slowly, circling the cabin, testing boundaries. At some point, I heard a scraping sound at the back door, then the handle rattling. My heart raced. I stayed low, flashlight off, knife in hand. The sounds faded, replaced by silence, then sudden heavy footsteps receding into the trees. I waited until morning, exhausted and trembling, and finally ventured outside. Footprints led away into the woods but didn't go far. They seemed to stop abruptly, as if whoever it was had vanished into the forest. That day, I reinforced the cabin further, barricading doors, stacking heavy furniture near windows, and preparing for the possibility that the intruder could return. Days 6 and 7 passed in a tense rhythm. The intruder did not appear, but signs were everywhere. Footprints, broken branches, disturbed soil. I stayed vigilant, moving cautiously, only stepping outside when necessary, always watching for movement among the trees. By the 7th night, I felt drained, but also more aware, more prepared. I made sure the firewood was stacked near the stove, the knife and flashlight ready, and my bag packed in case I needed to leave quickly. On the morning of the 8th day, I decided it was time to leave. I had survived, and the thought of facing another night was unbearable. I packed my things carefully, checking every corner of the cabin for signs of entry. As I stepped outside, I noticed something new. A crude marker in the dirt, a small pile of stones arranged deliberately at the edge of the clearing. Whoever had been watching me left it as a warning, or perhaps just a signature. I felt a surge of relief and fear simultaneously. I didn't linger. I moved quickly down the narrow dirt road, checking behind me constantly, the jeep waiting at the end. The forest seemed alive, watching, but I kept moving. I reached the jeep, jumped in, and started the engine. I didn't care about the noise, the dust, or anything else. I drove down the winding road, the forest pressing in from both sides, and only when I reached the main highway did I finally exhale. I stopped at the first gas station, called a friend, and told them where I had been. They came to meet me and we drove back to town. Even in the daylight and the safety of civilization, I could feel the weight of the forest pressing on me. I knew that whoever had been watching the cabin could still be out there, but I was safe, at least for now. Looking back, the experience changed me. The forest had tested me, stripped away my confidence and my sense of security. I had relied on instincts, vigilance, and careful planning to survive. The cabin itself had been a trap and a refuge at the same time. A place that offered isolation and beauty, but also vulnerability. When I finally returned home, I strengthened my doors, installed security cameras, and made sure never to underestimate the quiet, patient threats of the world outside the city. The forest remained a place I loved, but one I respected deeply, understanding that beauty and danger often walk side by side. That week in the cabin, alone and hunted, had taught me more about survival and awareness than any course or training ever could. I had left the cabin physically unharmed, but I carried with me a constant reminder that isolation could be as threatening as any person, and that vigilance was not just a habit, it was a necessity. I spent the day exploring cautiously. I marked a few trails, making sure I could find my way back. The sense of being watched never left me, though the sunlight made it easier to ignore. I found an old path, overgrown with brush, that seemed to have been used recently. Footprints were faint but visible, human. Someone had been here, walking through the forest. I scanned the trees, the underbrush. Nothing. No one in sight. Night came again, darker than before. I lit the stove and ate in silence. I tried to read, tried to keep my mind busy, but the noises outside were louder, sharper. The scratching at the trees, the rustling, the faint thumps that seemed to follow me wherever I went inside the cabin. I realized I could not stay in one place without noticing them. I needed a plan. I decided I would stay awake and wait. I stacked firewood, checking the locks, making sure I could barricade the doors if necessary. I thought about escape routes where I could run if someone tried to enter. The nearest road was at least 2 miles through the forest. I had no weapon, only a few tools that could serve as makeshift protection. I stayed alert, sitting near the window, flashlight in hand, watching the dark forest. Around midnight, the sound returned, louder this time. Not a branch or an animal. Heavy footsteps, deliberate, moving slowly around the edge of the clearing. I froze, trying to control my breathing. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then continued, closer this time. I grabbed a large wrench from the kitchen drawer, my only real protection, and moved quietly toward the door. The sound of footsteps on the porch made me jump. Someone was there. I stayed low, waiting, trying to think. The person did not enter, did not knock, did not make a sound except the scraping of boots. Then, slowly, deliberately, the footsteps moved back toward the forest. I waited, listening for any return. Hours passed, and the forest was silent again. I did not sleep that night. Morning came. I was exhausted, but the sunlight made the fear slightly easier to bear. I made a decision. I would leave. I packed quickly, taking only what I needed, leaving most of my gear behind. The drive down the mountain was tense. Every shadow seemed like someone watching. Every movement in the forest felt deliberate. I did not stop, not once. When I reached the main road, the first signs of civilization were a huge relief. The town ahead, the cars, the buildings, all of it made me feel safe. I checked into a small motel, still shaking, and tried to calm down. I called the authorities the next morning and reported what I had seen, the footprints, the marks, the sounds. They came to inspect the cabin. The local police found evidence of someone camping illegally near the cabin. Footprints, remnants of a small fire, and some discarded items. There had been no one staying in the cabin, but someone had been close, watching, moving around the property at night. I never went back. The cabin remained available for rent, but I could never bring myself to return. The memory of those nights, the scraping, the footsteps, the constant feeling of being watched, stayed with me. I learned to always check the surroundings, to trust my instincts when something feels off, and never underestimate the danger of isolation. That trip taught me a lot about fear, about being prepared, and about the limits of human control over the world around them. Even in the most peaceful, beautiful places, danger can be near, unseen and silent, waiting in the shadows. The experience stayed with me for years. I still remember the smell of the pine, the sound of the wind through the trees, the way the darkness pressed against the windows. But I also remember the relief of escape, the sense of control I regained when I reached safety. I never camped alone in a remote area again. I never underestimated isolation again. And I never forgot that fear, raw and real, can be as close as the trees outside your window. I had been looking forward to this weekend for months. After weeks of constant work, the endless hum of the city, and the suffocating closeness of my apartment, I finally had the chance to escape. The cabin I rented was tucked away in the mountains, far from any main roads, deep in the wilderness. I had found it online, a small, rustic cabin, completely isolated, with no internet, no cell service, and a wood stove for heat. The pictures had been beautiful. A weathered wooden structure with a small porch overlooking the forest, tall pines and firs stretching in every direction, and a narrow dirt path that disappeared into the trees. I wanted solitude, a weekend to think, to read, and to just breathe. I did not expect fear to be a part of that plan, and certainly not the kind of fear that makes every sound, every shadow, every movement feel like a threat. The drive out was long but uneventful. The city gradually gave way to rolling hills, small rivers cutting through the land, and the forest that would eventually swallow the cabin entirely. I had printed a map, double-checked my GPS before I left, and packed extra food, water, and supplies just in case. The last few miles were dirt roads, narrow and winding, surrounded by trees so thick that sunlight barely touched the ground. I passed a few abandoned-looking houses, their windows dark, paint peeling, and yards overgrown. The air began to smell cleaner. The only sounds the tires crunching over the dirt and the occasional bird calling in the distance. When I finally arrived, the cabin was exactly as advertised. It was small, maybe 2 rooms at most, with a loft that could serve as a sleeping area. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, the railing loose, and the door creaked when I opened it. Inside, it was dark, the only light coming from the windows that framed the forest outside. Dust covered the floor, and cobwebs clung to the corners. The smell of old wood and pine lingered. There was a small kitchen area with a sink and an old gas stove, a few plates and cups stacked on a shelf, and a wood stove in the corner of the main room. A ladder led to the loft above, where a mattress lay unmade on the floor. I had brought my sleeping bag just in case, though I didn't think I would need it on top of the mattress. I spent the afternoon settling in, unpacking my bag, and exploring the small surroundings. Behind the cabin, the land sloped down into a dense forest, almost completely dark in places where the trees grew thick. I found a small stream trickling through the rocks, and I marked it mentally as my water source if I needed to refill. The forest was quiet, almost eerily so. There were birds and squirrels, but there were long stretches of silence where it felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. I told myself this was normal, that isolation always felt strange at first. As the sun began to set, I lit the wood stove and prepared a simple dinner. The wind picked up outside, making the trees creak and groan, and shadows from the fire flickered across the walls. I tried to read, but I found my eyes drawn to the window, to the darkness beyond the glass. Every movement among the trees made my stomach tighten. I told myself it was just deer or small animals, but the fear was creeping in, subtle and insistent. By the time I went to sleep, the wind had turned into gusts that rattled the cabin's walls, and I found myself double-checking that the door was locked and the windows closed. I fell asleep finally, exhausted, with the sound of wind and trees in my ears. The next morning, I woke early to a thin layer of frost covering the ground. The air was sharp and cold, and the forest seemed even quieter than the day before. I decided to explore the area more, to feel less trapped. I walked along the dirt path that led deeper into the woods, keeping track of landmarks so I could find my way back. The forest floor was littered with needles and leaves, and every step made a crunching sound that echoed in the still air. I came across a fallen tree that had created a natural bridge over a small creek, and I spent some time observing a group of birds hopping among the branches. The beauty of the place was undeniable, but an edge of tension lingered. By midday, I returned to the cabin to eat and warm up. The wind had calmed, but the silence was more oppressive now that I was aware of it. I could hear every creak, every shift of wood, every tiny sound amplified. I decided to go out again in the late afternoon, following another trail I had noticed, hoping to see more wildlife or just enjoy the fresh air. As I walked, I kept thinking about how alone I was. No one knew where I was, no one could reach me easily, and the roads back to civilization were long and twisting. I had prepared for emergencies, but even the most cautious plans can falter. It was during this second walk that I noticed something unusual. At first, it was small. A broken branch lying across the path in a way that suggested it had been stepped over recently. Then I saw the footprints. They were larger than mine, and the spacing suggested a tall person. They weren't far from the cabin, and they weren't from any of the animals I knew. I froze. My heart began to pound. I told myself it was probably a hunter, someone passing through, but the thought didn't ease the tension. The tracks didn't seem hurried, just deliberate, and they seemed to circle around the cabin area. I made a mental note to go back immediately, keeping an eye out for movement. Back at the cabin, I locked the doors and checked the windows. I could hear the wind rustling through the trees, but now there was another sound, subtle but distinct, the sound of footsteps crunching over the leaves. I told myself it was my imagination, but then I heard it again, slower this time, closer. My stomach tightened, and I realized with a sudden clarity how vulnerable I was. There was no one around for miles, and if someone intended harm, I was alone and unarmed. I had a small pocket knife in my bag, but it wouldn't do much against a determined person. The hours that followed were a mix of fear and vigilance. I stayed near the wood stove, trying to appear calm, though I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was outside. Every sound made me jump. The cracking of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the occasional bird taking flight. I thought about retreating to my car and driving back to the nearest town, but the thought of encountering whoever had been following me along the narrow dirt roads made me hesitate. The sun began to set, and with darkness came a new level of anxiety. Shadows in the forest seemed to move, though I knew it was only the trees swaying in the wind. Still, the idea that someone could be out there, watching, waiting, made it impossible to relax. Around midnight, I was awakened by a noise at the cabin door. A soft thump, followed by silence. My heart raced. I gripped the pocket knife and crept toward the door, straining to hear. The wind had died down, leaving only the sound of my own breathing and the faint rustle of leaves. Another thump, then silence again. I considered calling the police, but there was no cell service, and even if I could, it would take hours for anyone to arrive. My mind raced through every possible scenario, from a harmless hiker to someone with ill intent. I knew I couldn't ignore it. I decided the safest option was to barricade myself. I moved the heavier furniture in front of the door and windows, making it harder to enter. I gathered matches and kept them in my pocket, just in case. I stayed in the loft where I could see the main room and the front door. Every sound made my stomach twist with fear. Hours passed, each longer than the last. I couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about the possibility of someone breaking in. Morning brought a weak light through the windows, and with it, a sense of relief. The furniture was still in place, and the cabin was silent. I cautiously went outside, inspecting the perimeter. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints circling the cabin, clear and fresh, but now with a trail leading away into the deeper woods. Whoever it had been had left. I felt a mix of relief and lingering fear, knowing that someone had been there, close enough to touch the cabin. I spent the next day methodically preparing for my departure. I packed my belongings, reinforced the doors one last time, and kept a close eye on the forest as I loaded the car. The isolation that had felt peaceful and restorative the day before now felt dangerous and oppressive. Couldn't wait to leave. When I finally drove away, I kept the windows up and the doors locked, my eyes constantly scanning the edges of the forest for any movement. I felt the tension ease only when I reached the main road, where I could see other cars and buildings. Weeks later, I learned that someone had been spotted in the area, a drifter who had been breaking into cabins and stealing supplies. They had never been caught, but I realized how close I had come to encountering them. The cabin was exactly as it had appeared online, beautiful and isolated, but it had hidden risks I had not fully considered. The fear I experienced was real, grounded in the isolation, the lack of escape routes, and the knowledge that another human could have been watching me for hours. Looking back, I understand now that preparation is only part of staying safe in the wilderness. Awareness, caution, and the ability to act quickly matter just as much. I learned to respect the forest, its beauty and its silence, but also the unpredictability of human behavior in those isolated spaces. I never returned to that cabin, but the memory of that weekend, the tension, the fear, and the relief, stays with me. It taught me the importance of vigilance and the fragility of solitude, and how easily a place that feels peaceful can turn into a trap if one is not careful. That cabin, the forest surrounding it, and the footprints left behind became a lesson etched into my memory. I realized that fear is not about the unknown in the supernatural sense. It is about understanding what is possible, acknowledging one's vulnerability, and taking careful steps to ensure survival. I came home with every sense heightened, every nerve alert, and a renewed appreciation for both safety and the unpredictable nature of human life. The experience was terrifying, but it ended with clarity. I survived because I was alert, cautious, and aware. The cabin remained empty and silent, a testament to how beautiful and dangerous solitude can be when miscalculated. I had been planning this trip for months, a solo retreat into the mountains to get away from everything. My life at the time had become a constant whirl of work deadlines, endless emails, and the noise of the city pressing down on me. I wanted to escape, to spend a week alone, with only the trees, the wind, and the occasional wildlife to keep me company. I found a small, rustic cabin online, far from the nearest town, deep in a national forest. It was the kind of place that promised silence, isolation, and a chance to reset. The cabin's description was simple. Wooden structure, 2 rooms, a fireplace, a small kitchen, and no electricity, no running water. The thought of disconnecting completely was thrilling. The drive up to the cabin was long. The roads became narrower and rougher as I left the main highway, winding through dense forests that swallowed the daylight. By the time I turned onto the final dirt road that led to the cabin, the sun was already dipping below the horizon. I had read that this area could get cold even in late summer, and the temperature was already dropping. My car's headlights illuminated nothing beyond a few dozen feet, and the woods seemed to press in from all sides. I arrived at the cabin just as it was growing dark. The place looked exactly like the pictures, more weathered than the photos suggested, but solid. The cabin was surrounded by trees, with a small clearing in front and a narrow path leading back into the forest. There was a small pile of firewood stacked neatly against the side of the cabin. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The smell of old wood and faint mold hit me immediately, but it was not unpleasant, just a reminder that the cabin had been uninhabited for a while. Dust covered the surfaces, and the floor creaked beneath my feet. I set down my backpack and walked around, inspecting the small kitchen, the fireplace, and the loft bedroom. There was a stack of old newspapers from several months ago and a few broken chairs, but otherwise it was empty. I set about making a fire in the fireplace, careful to stack the wood just right to get a good flame going. The fire roared to life, sending a warm glow across the room. For a moment, I felt a deep sense of calm. The isolation, the smell of burning wood, the quiet of the forest around me. It was everything I had wanted. That night, as I lay on the thin mattress in the loft, I felt the first stirrings of unease. It was not anything I could put a name to, just a prickling awareness that I was alone in a place far from anyone. The wind picked up, rattling the windows, and somewhere outside, the forest made noises. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, the distant call of an animal. I told myself it was nothing, that it was just the forest, and eventually, I fell asleep. The next day, I woke early, the sunlight streaming through the small window of the loft. I had brought a backpack with food, water, and supplies, knowing there would be no store for miles. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin, following the narrow trails that disappeared into the trees. I noticed that the forest was thick, almost suffocating, and it was easy to lose track of time and direction. I marked my path with small piles of stones so I could find my way back. Around midday, I saw a small stream and bent down to fill my water bottle, listening to the quiet flow of water. Everything felt peaceful, almost idyllic. By late afternoon, I returned to the cabin and prepared another fire. I sat by it, eating my simple meal, feeling the sun warm my back as it dropped lower in the sky. That evening, as darkness fell, I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the dirt around the cabin, fresh and clearly made by someone walking in heavy boots. My heart jumped. I was alone, miles from anyone, and yet someone had been here. I tried to convince myself it was just a ranger or a hiker passing through, but the footprints were too close to the cabin for comfort. I spent the rest of the night listening, straining to hear any sounds outside. I saw shadows moving in the trees, though the wind could have been the cause. I didn't sleep much that night, keeping the fire going, my eyes on the small windows. The following day, I made a decision to stay inside most of the time, exploring only briefly when necessary. I carried a small hatchet with me, not for hunting but for a sense of security. The forest that had seemed peaceful the day before now felt oppressive. Every rustle in the underbrush made me flinch. I realized that in my desire for solitude, I had underestimated how vulnerable I truly was. That afternoon, I noticed more footprints around the cabin, and they were circling closer, appearing to have come from the woods and then gone back into them. Someone had been observing me, moving silently when I wasn't looking. My stomach sank with the realization that I was not alone. I spent that night with the fire blazing, keeping the door locked and barricaded as best I could. I checked every window and made sure there were no easy points of entry. The wind howled, making the trees groan, and I jumped at every snap of a branch. Time passed slowly, the darkness feeling almost solid, pressing in on me. At some point, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A deliberate knock on the side of the cabin. Not a branch falling, not the wind. An actual knock, slow and heavy. I froze. My mind raced through every possibility, trying to rationalize it, but the fear was undeniable. The knocking continued, irregular but deliberate, long enough to make it clear that someone was there. I didn't move, couldn't. My only thought was to survive the night. I kept the fire alive, listening to the sound until it finally stopped. The forest fell silent again, but I knew it was temporary. Then came the night that truly tested me. I had gone out earlier in the day to check the trail I had discovered, looking for water sources and potential escape routes. I had moved farther than usual, following the creek until the trees thinned slightly, revealing a small clearing. It was beautiful, deceptively calm. I noticed a series of tracks that were more pronounced, fresher than any I had seen. Panic settled in as I realized they led directly back toward the cabin. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. If I moved, I would only draw attention to myself. I stayed, hiding behind a fallen log, watching as shadows moved along the tree line. They seemed almost aware of me. I didn't stay long. I returned to the cabin cautiously, keeping low, moving quietly, my heart hammering in my chest. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The light was fading fast. I closed the door behind me, bolting it securely, and inspected the windows again. That night, the noises were closer than ever. Heavy thuds, scraping against the walls, low growls that resonated through the floor. I stayed awake, gripping my knife, listening to every sound, every subtle movement. At one point, something tried to push the door. The cabin shuddered under the force, and I backed away, pressing against the far wall, my breathing shallow. It continued for what felt like hours, until finally, dawn began to break. Exhausted, I fell into a fitful sleep, waking hours later with the first light of morning streaming through the windows. I knew then I couldn't stay another night. My supplies were adequate for a few more days, but I didn't care. The presence outside the cabin was intelligent, deliberate, and possibly dangerous. I packed my gear with methodical urgency, double-checking the doors, making sure I left no trace behind that could invite curiosity. I had no clear idea what I would encounter on the trail back to the main road, but staying was no longer an option. The hike out was nerve-wracking. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves, set my nerves on edge. I kept my knife ready and a large stick for defense, though I doubted it would be effective if whatever was following me decided to attack. The trail was rougher going than I remembered, and I had to navigate around fallen trees, slick rocks, and mud. The tracks I had seen earlier reappeared at points, crossing my path, then vanishing again. My senses were heightened, every shadow and movement amplified. Hours passed, the sun rising higher, and still, I felt that presence, tracking me, patient, silent. Finally, I emerged onto a small dirt road. Relief washed over me in a wave that made my knees weak. I ran the last stretch, not daring to look back until I reached a more traveled road. By the time a car appeared, and I flagged it down, I was covered in sweat, dirt, and cuts from branches. The driver, a local heading to town, looked at me in concern as I climbed in and explained nothing, just accepting the safety of the moving vehicle. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station in the next town, and even then, I stayed vigilant, scanning the surrounding woods for any hint that I had been followed. The cabin stayed in my mind long after. I never returned. Later, I learned from locals that the area had occasional sightings of wild predators, large bears, mountain lions, and even wolves. but the tracks and scratches I had seen didn't match any known animal exactly. Whatever it had been intelligent enough to observe, stalk, and test my reactions without direct attack. I never went back to the northern woods, never stayed alone again, but the experience left an indelible mark. I had gone seeking solitude, tranquility, and escape, only to confront the raw, unpredictable intensity of nature. The sharp reminder that in the wild, you are never truly alone, and that intelligence and danger often walk together silently, unseen, patient, and calculating. The ending, though terrifying in its reality, was clear. I survived because I respected the limits of my own safety, because I recognized the signs, because I chose to leave. It wasn't luck or heroism. It was awareness and caution. The forest had tested me, and I had passed only by acknowledging that my presence there was temporary, fragile, and ultimately expendable. That lesson, burned into my memory, would stay with me far longer than any fear of ghosts or monsters, because it was real. It was life and death, and I had returned to life. I had been planning this cabin trip for months. The idea of spending a long weekend alone in the woods had a strange appeal, a mix of relief from the city and a personal test of endurance. I wanted isolation, quiet, and a place where I could escape my constant thoughts. The cabin I rented was small, a wooden structure tucked deep in the pine forest, with a narrow dirt road leading to it. The map had been clear, but still, getting there felt like threading through some forgotten part of the world. My car bounced over rocks and ruts, and by the time I reached the clearing where the cabin stood, the sun was low, casting a yellow-orange light through the thin mist that clung to the trees. The cabin itself was old but sturdy. Its wood was weathered, rough, and smelled of years of rain and pine. I parked my car and stepped onto the porch. The boards creaked under my weight. Windows were covered with thin, dusty curtains, and a small chimney hinted at a fireplace inside. I set my bag down, and the first thing I noticed was the absolute silence. It wasn't the kind of silence that hums with life. It was the hollow, thick quiet that presses against your ears and chest. The kind of silence that makes your own movements sound loud. I unpacked my things slowly, feeling a strange tension in my chest, though I told myself it was just the anticipation. The interior smelled strongly of wood and damp. Dust motes floated in the thin shafts of light coming through the windows. I checked the fireplace first. There was some old wood stacked neatly, dry enough to burn. The cabin had a small kitchen area, a single bedroom, and a tiny bathroom with an old shower. Nothing fancy, but everything seemed usable. I set about making a small fire to warm the room, stacking wood carefully, and lighting it. Flames licked the walls of the fireplace, casting shadows that danced across the room. It felt comforting at first, but then the shadows seemed heavier, darker, moving in ways that made my skin tighten. Night came quickly. The sun fell below the horizon, leaving the forest around me in near darkness, broken only by the weak glow of my fire. I ate a simple dinner, mostly canned goods I had brought with me. The wind outside began to pick up, whistling through gaps in the cabin walls and around the eaves of the roof. The sound was soft at first, then harsher, rattling the old wooden frame. I tried to read, but the book felt meaningless, my mind constantly drawn to the noises outside. The trees groaned, branches scraping against each other, the occasional sound of twigs snapping from unseen movements. I told myself it was just animals, deer or raccoons maybe, but the tension in my chest kept rising. Sleep was difficult. I tried to lie on the narrow bed, the mattress creaking under me. Every noise in the cabin sounded amplified. The wind, the trees, the small floorboards contracting in the cold night. Somewhere far off, I thought I heard a voice, faint and carried by the wind, though I knew no one else was here. I kept telling myself I imagined it. I closed my eyes, but each time I drifted towards sleep, a snap of a branch outside would jerk me awake, my heart hammering. I finally fell asleep, exhausted and tense, only to be woken by the sound of something heavy moving outside. It wasn't soft or cautious. It sounded deliberate, slow, and weighted, like someone dragging something across the ground. I froze, listening. The wind was gone. Every small forest sound had vanished. leaving just that heavy, deliberate movement. My mind raced. The cabin door had a simple latch, nothing more. I didn't have a weapon, only my backpack with some food and my flashlight. I thought about calling the police, but there was no signal, not even one bar. The movement stopped suddenly, and for a long minute, there was nothing. Then a low, hard thump against the side of the cabin made me jump. I pressed myself against the wall, trying to listen without making a sound. Another thump, this time against the back window. I realized I wasn't imagining it. Someone or something was outside. My hands shook as I grabbed the flashlight. I thought about the windows and the door. There were no other exits. I switched on the light, scanning the dark outside, but the forest swallowed everything. Trees stretched upward, shadows shifting in the dim beam, nothing visible but the sway of branches in the breeze, or maybe not just the breeze. I moved to the door, testing the latch. It held. The door itself was thick, heavy, but every thump against the walls made the structure vibrate under my fingers. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud and panicked. Hours passed like this. Every sound set my nerves on fire. I tried to stay calm, making slow checks around the cabin, inspecting each door and window. Nothing was broken. The noise had stopped for a while. I thought maybe it had been a bear or some animal, but there was a deliberate quality to the sounds, a rhythm that didn't match a deer or raccoon. I rationed my flashlight battery, keeping it on low, trying to calm down. I tried lying back on the bed, but sleep was impossible. The tension in my chest refused to let me rest. Morning brought no relief. The first light showed the forest still heavy and dark. I went outside, carefully circling the cabin. Nothing. The ground was undisturbed, aside from the usual animal tracks. I began to think maybe I had been paranoid, the result of the isolation and the darkness. I prepared breakfast slowly, still uneasy, every sound from the forest making me flinch. It wasn't until later in the day that I found it. Near the back of the cabin, where the ground sloped slightly down toward a small creek, I saw clear signs of someone being there. Footprints, large, muddy, partially hidden by leaves, leading to and from the cabin. There were drag marks in the mud, like someone had pulled something heavy. My stomach turned over. I took pictures with my phone, the little battery I had left, and then moved quickly to think. I needed to leave, but the road back was long, and the isolation was real. I packed quickly, keeping my senses sharp, ears listening to the forest. Every crack and whisper made me jump. I locked the cabin as best I could and walked to my car. The forest seemed alive around me, as if watching, every shadow a potential threat. The dirt road was worse than the night before, rutted and uneven, forcing me to go slow. My heart raced with every sound of tires on rock. When I finally reached a point where I could get a signal, I called the authorities. They assured me someone would investigate, and I drove the last stretch back to the main road as fast as I dared, eyes constantly scanning the trees. Weeks later, I learned the police had found evidence of trespassers in the area. There had been a small group living rough in the woods, sometimes moving between abandoned cabins. They hadn't harmed me directly, but the signs were there, and the potential for danger was real. I realized how lucky I had been to survive without confrontation, relying only on caution, vigilance, and the locked door. That cabin, once a dream of peaceful isolation, became a lesson in awareness. I never returned to that place, and I made a point of telling myself that solitude in the wild, however alluring, was never entirely safe. The memory of that night stayed with me, a constant reminder of vulnerability. I think about the sounds in the dark, the way every shadow seemed to stretch and move, the thumps that shook the walls, and the silence that pressed against me afterward. It changed how I approached solitude, how I measured the risk in quiet places. Even now, I sometimes see a cabin or a dense forest and remember the fear, the tension, the need to trust only in preparation, vigilance, and my own instincts. I had been planning the cabin trip for months. I needed a break from the city, from the constant noise, the crowded streets, the endless pressure of work and obligations. A week alone in the woods sounded like heaven. The cabin I rented was about 3 hours from the nearest town, deep in a forested area that, according to the listing, was quiet and remote. I liked quiet, but I didn't fully understand how isolated remote truly meant until I turned off the main road onto the gravel path that led to it. The forest closed in on either side, tall pine trees arching over the road like a tunnel, shadows stretching across the uneven dirt, making the path ahead look darker than it should have been in the middle of the afternoon. When I first saw the cabin, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. It was an old wooden structure, weathered by years of rain and snow, but solid-looking. The paint had peeled in patches, and the windows had a layer of dust and grime. From a distance, it looked almost abandoned, but I had the key, and I had double-checked the rental contract, so I knew it was safe, or at least that's what I kept telling myself. I parked my car and stepped out. The air was cold, sharper than I expected, the smell of pine and damp earth filling my lungs. The forest was silent, except for the occasional bird or rustle of small animals in the underbrush. No other humans, no cars, no signs of civilization, just me and the cabin. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air smelled of old wood and something faintly metallic, like rust. The cabin was small, with a single main room that served as the living area and kitchen, a tiny bathroom in the back, and a loft bedroom above. There was an old wood stove, a stack of firewood in the corner, and basic furniture. A small table, a couple of chairs, a bed with a faded quilt. I set my bags down and walked around, inspecting everything. The floorboards creaked under my weight, and I noticed cobwebs in some corners, dust on the shelves. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean enough, and it had what I needed. I spent the first hour unpacking and settling in. I started a fire in the stove, feeling the warmth slowly spread through the cabin, and made myself some coffee. Outside, the sun was starting to dip behind the trees, the shadows lengthening, the forest darkening. I had been looking forward to this, the quiet, the solitude, but as darkness fell, a creeping tension started to settle in my chest. It wasn't fear at first, just an odd awareness of being completely alone, completely cut off from anyone who could help me if something went wrong. After dinner, I decided to check the surrounding area. The cabin had a small clearing around it, maybe 30 feet in every direction before the trees pressed back in. I walked slowly around, shining my flashlight into the shadows. Everything looked normal except for the occasional movement of small animals. I reassured myself. Bears and larger predators were rare here, especially in late autumn. I had a pocket knife, a hatchet, and a small hunting rifle I had brought, just in case. Mostly, I carried them for peace of mind. The forest was beautiful, but I was starting to feel the weight of its silence. Night fell fully, and the darkness was intense. I had no neighbors to hear me scream if something happened. The wind began to pick up, whistling through the trees, making the branches creak and sway. I sat by the stove, reading a book, but I kept glancing at the windows. Shadows moved outside, small animals probably, but every time I saw one, my stomach tightened. I reminded myself over and over that I was alone, but that didn't make it easier. The isolation made every sound sharper. The wind, the trees, even the cabin itself settling with soft thumps and groans. It was normal, all of it. But in the dark, alone, it felt like something else entirely. I went to bed around 10. The loft bedroom was small, the mattress thin but comfortable enough. I pulled the quilt over myself, listening to the wind and the occasional distant animal sound. I tried to sleep, but I kept hearing a scratching sound outside the cabin. Faint at first, then louder. I froze, straining to listen. Came again, scratching like claws against wood. I told myself it was a raccoon or a squirrel, but it sounded too heavy, too deliberate. My heart started to race. I stayed still, holding my breath, listening. The scratching moved along the side of the cabin, circling slowly. I considered staying awake all night, but exhaustion won. I fell into a fitful sleep. I remember the first time I decided to take a break from everything and just disappear into the woods. I had been working nonstop for months, my job draining more of me than I realized, and I needed space. When I found the cabin online, a small listing on a local rental site, I felt relief wash over me. It was secluded, deep in the woods of northern Maine, far from any neighbors, and had a single dirt road leading to it. The pictures were simple: a wooden cabin with a small porch, a fire pit outside, and large windows that opened onto thick pine trees. The owner assured me it was quiet, private, and perfect for someone looking to get away. I didn't question it. I booked a week. I drove up in my old Jeep, the tires crunching on the rough, gravel road that led into the dense forest. The last few miles were narrow, winding, and flanked by thick trees that blocked most of the sunlight. The air had that crisp, piney smell that makes your lungs feel clean. When I reached the cabin, I stepped out and looked around. It was smaller than I imagined, but solid, rustic, and sturdy. There was no electricity, only a generator I could run if necessary, and a wood-burning stove inside. The isolation thrilled me, but as I carried my bags inside, I noticed the silence. It wasn't peaceful. It was almost oppressive. No birds, no wind rustling through the trees, just a thick, heavy quiet. I brushed it off as the area's remoteness. The cabin itself was simple but functional. A single room had a small kitchen area, a stove, and a table. A loft above served as a bedroom. The walls were wooden planks, and the windows were thin glass. Outside, I could see the trees pressing in from every side. I unpacked quickly, wanting to settle in before dark. By the time I lit the stove and made a small dinner of canned beans and bread, the sun was dipping behind the trees. Shadows stretched long and strange over the cabin walls. The forest felt alive in a way I wasn't used to. Every branch scratching against another, every bird or small animal moving just out of sight, seemed magnified in that quiet. I went to bed early, hoping the first night would pass without incident. That first night, I barely slept. I would drift off and wake to strange noises. Branches scraping against the cabin, the thud of something heavy moving outside, the occasional snapping of twigs. At first, I convinced myself it was just deer, raccoons, or other wildlife. But the sounds didn't make sense sometimes. A heavy footstep, too loud for a raccoon, too deliberate to be a deer. I lay awake, staring at the loft ceiling, imagining all sorts of explanations. I had packed a small hunting knife, a flashlight, and extra batteries. I told myself I was just being paranoid, a city person and used to the forest. By dawn, the sounds stopped, and I fell into an exhausted sleep. The next day, I tried to calm myself by exploring the surrounding area. The cabin sat on a small clearing surrounded by thick pine and birch trees. A narrow dirt path led away from it, but I didn't see signs of any other people. The forest was dense, and as I walked, I realized how isolated I really was. I spent the day chopping firewood, setting up a small supply of food, and just observing the surroundings. The forest was beautiful, but there was an edge to it. Something in the way the shadows moved or the wind seemed to carry sounds from unseen places. That night, I tried to sleep again, but the sounds returned, louder, closer. I heard a series of knocks against the cabin wall, soft at first, then deliberate, like someone testing if I was inside. I froze, gripping the knife, straining to hear more. After an hour, the knocking stopped, replaced by a dragging noise across the dirt outside. I stayed awake until dawn, every sense alert. By the third day, I realized that I wasn't alone. I had dismissed it at first, but the signs were clear. Footprints in the dirt around the cabin. Not animal prints, larger, heavier. Broken branches near the windows where something had tried to peer in. I felt exposed, like the forest itself was watching me. I tried to leave the cabin and check the road, thinking someone might be following the cabin rental listing or watching the place for whatever reason. When I walked the road, I saw no vehicles, no sign of anyone else, just the tracks in the mud circling the area, always close to the cabin but not leading away. That night, I stayed in the loft, knife in hand, flashlight on, listening. The sounds came again, scraping, heavy steps, something dragging. I felt trapped, the forest around me a cage. Sleep was impossible. On the fourth day, I decided to confront the situation. I started setting up small defenses around the cabin, stacking heavy logs near windows, securing the doors with makeshift locks from spare wood, leaving a few empty cans strung on string outside to make noise if someone approached. I also moved rocks and logs to mark the perimeter so I could tell if someone had crossed it. The forest was quiet during the day, eerily so. Even the birds seemed absent. As evening fell, I could feel my tension rising. The noises returned earlier, just as the sun began to disappear behind the trees. Scraping at the cabin walls, knocks, then the unmistakable sound of footsteps circling. I stayed in the loft, silent, breathing slowly, listening. At one point, I caught a glimpse of movement outside, something tall, moving slowly between the trees, always staying just at the edge of the clearing. The fifth day was the worst. The intruder seemed bolder. Footsteps on the porch in the morning, a branch shoved against the door while I was preparing breakfast, rocks thrown near the windows. I could hear whispers carried on the wind, though I knew no one was close enough to be speaking. I packed essentials into a small bag, knife, flashlight, food, water, and sat in the loft, thinking, planning. I couldn't call for help. The cabin was so remote that cell service was non-existent. I considered hiking down the road to the nearest town, but the forest was too dense and unfamiliar. Something made me feel that leaving the cabin without preparation would be dangerous. I needed a plan. I had been planning this trip for months. The idea of escaping the city, leaving behind the constant noise, the traffic, the endless demands at work, felt more necessary than anything else I had experienced in years. I had found a small cabin online, somewhere in the mountains far away from the nearest town. The pictures looked perfect, surrounded by dense forest, built of weathered timber, with a small porch facing a clearing that opened onto the mountainside. It seemed quiet, secluded, and just what I needed to finally disconnect from everything for a few days. I packed my car carefully, making sure I had enough food, water, and supplies. I had camping gear too, even though the cabin had electricity and running water. I wanted to be prepared for anything. My car rumbled along the winding mountain roads, the sun lowering behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the forest. By the time I reached the dirt path leading to the cabin, it was getting late. The last stretch of road was narrow, overgrown in places, and uneven. I drove slowly, gripping the steering wheel tighter than usual. There were moments when I felt like the car might slide off the side if I made the slightest mistake. Finally, I reached the cabin. It was smaller than the picture suggested, but that wasn't a problem. The place had a charm to it, a rough, rustic feel. I parked in front of the porch and got out, stretching after the long drive. The air smelled like pine and wet earth, a mixture that felt strangely calming and sharp at the same time. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The interior was simple, practical. A small kitchen with old but functional appliances, a living area with a wood-burning stove, a few chairs, and a table. There were 2 bedrooms, one of which I would be using. The windows were dusty, letting in weak light from the fading sun. I set my things down and walked through the cabin, taking it all in. I lit the stove and made a small fire. The sound of the crackling would fill the room, creating a warmth that went beyond the physical. I cooked a simple dinner and ate slowly, feeling a sense of relief at being somewhere quiet, somewhere my mind could finally rest. But as the light outside faded completely, a feeling started to creep in. A subtle, nagging unease that I couldn't shake. At first, I tried to tell myself it was just the isolation, that being alone in a strange place always made people nervous. But it was more than that. It was the way the darkness seemed to press against the windows, the way the forest outside was alive with sounds that were impossible to place. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, distant thumps. Nothing seemed right, yet nothing was visible. I went to check the locks on the doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. Everything seemed fine. The locks were sturdy, the windows closed tightly. I went back to the living room and sat near the stove, trying to read, trying to calm myself. The sound of the fire was comforting, and I told myself that I was being silly, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But the feeling persisted, the awareness that I was not entirely alone. Hours passed. The fire dwindled to embers, and I got ready for bed. The cabin was dark now, except for the weak moonlight filtering through the windows. I lay down, trying to sleep, but the noises outside were relentless. Every time I thought I had gotten used to one sound, another would come. A branch tapping against the roof, the distant howl of an animal, the soft crunch of something moving through the underbrush. My mind raced. I tried to rationalize everything. It was just animals. Bears, maybe a deer, raccoons, anything, nothing human. But that rationalization did little to calm me. I woke in the middle of the night to a loud sound that made my heart jump. It came from the back of the cabin, the side that faced the forest directly. I froze, straining to listen. There it was again, soft at first, then louder. A scraping, dragging sound, like someone moving a heavy object slowly across the ground. I told myself it was a tree branch falling, but the pattern was deliberate. It moved along the edge of the clearing, parallel to the cabin. I got out of bed quietly and grabbed a flashlight from the table. The beam cut through the darkness, landing on the trees outside. I scanned the clearing and the edge of the forest. Nothing, only shadows moving with the wind. My pulse was racing. I considered calling the local authorities, but I had no idea where exactly I was. Cell service was spotty at best. I needed to stay calm, stay rational. I decided to check the perimeter to make sure no one could have approached the cabin while I was sleeping. I moved slowly, flashlight in hand, circling the cabin. The forest was silent now, except for the usual night sounds of animals and wind. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone having been there. I breathed a small sigh of relief and returned inside, locking the doors once again. I sat by the stove, the flashlight on the table, keeping watch until dawn. Morning brought some relief. The sunlight seemed to make the forest less threatening. I made breakfast, slowly, keeping an eye on the windows. Nothing unusual appeared. I decided to explore the area, to see the cabin from the outside and get a better sense of the surroundings. I grabbed my pack, filled with water and a few tools, and stepped outside. The forest was dense, the trees tall and close together. The clearing around the cabin was small. As I walked the perimeter, I noticed small details I had not seen the night before. Marks on the tree trunks like scratches, some deep, some shallow. I paused, trying to figure out what could have made them. Animal claws, perhaps, though the pattern seemed odd. Too organized, too vertical. I noted the direction of the marks. They followed a straight path leading toward the forest, away from the cabin.